The puzzle of lost civilizations. There are moments in history that seem to dissolve, not with a whisper, but with a silence so profound it echoes across time. Civilizations that once carved their might into stone have vanished without explanation. Cities that bustled with life have crumbled into ruin, leaving no account of their fall. Entire chapters of human history have been erased, edited, or buried so deep that we can only grasp at fragments. Who were these people? What did they know? And why does it feel as though someone or something wanted us to forget? In the deserts, beneath the jungles, and hidden underwater, we find traces that don't quite fit the picture. Tools too advanced for their age, maps depicting lands supposedly unknown, symbols etched into stone that no one today can read. Each discovery brings more questions than answers, pulling us deeper into a past we felt we were never meant to understand. But today we will try. So dim the lights, let your imagination sail beyond recorded time, and join us as we unravel history's lost pages, one mystery at a time. The enigma of Sheba. In the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, where the desert meets the highlands and the wind whispers through forgotten valleys, a kingdom of riches and wonder once stood. Today the land is dry, scattered with the debris of ancient architecture, weathered stones that once formed walls, temples, and palaces. These silent ruins belong to the kingdom of Sheba, a civilization that flourished in what is now Yemen, its memory still lingering like ghosts in the dry heat. Known throughout the ancient world as Sheba, Saba was a land of frankincense and myrrh, of gold and spices, commodities so valuable they shaped the course of empires. The people of Saba controlled the incense routes, those winding desert trails that carried aromatic resins north to the markets of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. With each caravan, Saba grew wealthier, more sophisticated, and more enigmatic. What we know of Saba is pieced together from scattered inscriptions, fragmentary ruins, and echoes in ancient texts. The Old Testament speaks of the Queen of Sheba, who journeyed to King Solomon, bringing lavish gifts and riddles to test his wisdom. Islamic tradition names her Bilqis and attributes to her a palace of miraculous design, so perfect that its glass floor mimicked a pool of water. But what was the true nature of this lost kingdom beyond these legends? Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a vast and organized civilization. The capital city, Marib, was once home to the Great Dam, a marvel of ancient engineering that allowed the Sabaeans to tame the desert and support a thriving agricultural society. Yet something doesn't quite add up. For all its sophistication, the story of Saba remains incomplete. The kingdom's rise is barely understood, and its abrupt decline is even more so. By the 6th century CE, Saba had vanished from the historical stage. Absorbed or displaced by rival powers, its capital abandoned, its dam in ruins. How could such an influential civilization disappear so thoroughly, leaving so few definitive answers? Some scholars suggest environmental collapse played a role, that the destruction of the dam, whether from overuse, earthquakes, or neglect, crippled an economy so dependent on irrigation. Others point to shifting trade patterns. As new sea routes opened across the Red Sea, the incense routes declined, and with them, the fortunes of inland kingdoms like Saba. But beyond the rational explanations lie deeper mysteries. Inscriptions from neighboring civilizations mention Saba with awe, even deference. The Greeks and Romans wrote of its legendary wealth, calling it Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia. Yet no one can say for sure how far Saba's influence truly extended. Some fringe researchers speculate that Saba may have had colonies or outposts along the coast of East Africa, or even connections to the most elusive cultures of the ancient world. Could there have been a deeper exchange of knowledge, technology, or beliefs lost to time? Then there is the question of the Queen of Sheba herself. While mainstream historians view her as likely a literary composite, perhaps based on a powerful Sabaean ruler, others believe she may have been a real monarch whose reign was deliberately erased or whose story was magnified to the point of myth. The lack of a definitive royal tomb, coupled with the vague references in various traditions, keeps the debate alive. Some speculate her palace is still undiscovered beneath the sands or hidden among the hills. And what of Saba's spiritual world? The lunar god Almaka was central to their belief system, yet his cult disappeared with hardly a trace. What did the Sabians see in the night sky that led them to venerate the moon above all else? Were their temples observatories? Did they mark time or seasons? Or something more cryptic, perhaps even something they believed descended from the stars? As modern conflicts make large-scale excavations in Yemen difficult, much of Saba remains hidden, literally and figuratively. Satellite imagery suggests unexcavated sites. Inscriptions remain unread in forgotten corners. Artifacts lie buried, awaiting an era of peace that may never come. The kingdom of Saba endures, not as a political power, but as a riddle carved into stone and scattered across the desert. We see its shadows in the legends of distant lands, feel its presence in the scent of frankincense, and trace its boundaries in the ruined walls of Marib. But the heart of Saba, its ambitions, its fears, its truths, remains just beyond reach. What did they know that we do not? What secrets lie waiting beneath the sand? Let us keep searching. Cahokia, rise and fall of a North American city. Near the banks of the Mississippi River, in the heart of what is now the American Midwest, an ancient landscape rises from the earth in silent defiance of time. Grassy mounds, some modest, others towering as high as a 10-story building, dot the horizon like the remnants of a forgotten world. At the center stands Monk's Mound, a colossal earth pyramid, meticulously shaped by human hands, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is Cahokia, the jewel of the Mississippian civilization, a culture that, centuries ago, transformed forests and floodplains into a bustling urban center and then disappeared. At its peak, around 1100 CE, Cahokia may have been home to as many as 20,000 people, a size comparable to London at the time. It was a city of engineers, artists, and astronomers, a place of sacred geometry and celestial alignments. Here, entire communities gathered around central plazas and temples, their lives seemingly guided by a complex spiritual and social structure. The civilization stretched across dozens of present-day U.S. states, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, linked by a shared iconography, mound-building traditions, and a vast trade network. Yet the Mississippians left no written language behind, no known chronicles, no inscribed records explaining who they truly were, how they rose so quickly, and why they vanished. The archaeological remnants tell part of the story. At Cahokia and other mound sites like Moundville in Alabama or Etowah in Georgia, researchers have found evidence of sophisticated urban planning, wooden palisades, astronomical markers, and ritual objects carved from shell, stone, and copper. Burials within the mounds hint at a stratified society with elites and religious leaders, suggesting a theocratic or perhaps hereditary ruling class. At the center of Cahokia's ceremonial life was Woodhenge, a large circular arrangement of wooden posts aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. Much like Stonehenge in England, it likely served as a solar calendar, used for marking time and perhaps for significant religious events. But what cosmology guided this construction? What beliefs drove a people to build such monuments, dragging tons of earth basket by basket? Mainstream theories suggest Cahokia was the result of a population boom and agricultural innovation, particularly the cultivation of maize. This abundance likely fueled rapid growth, leading to complex social structures, specialized labor, and centralized authority. But others argue that this alone cannot account for the scale of its monuments or the uniformity of cultural practices across such a vast and diverse territory. There are signs that the Mississippians observed the heavens with precision. Artifacts featuring birdman motifs, solar symbols, and cosmic imagery suggest a worldview shaped by cycles, dualisms, and transformation. Some archaeologists believe these patterns hint at a unifying religious ideology, perhaps a priestly class that maintained order through ritual, celestial timing, and the awe of the unknown. Others wonder if they were influenced by even older cultures to the south. Could the Mississippians have had contact with Mesoamerican civilizations? Parallels in iconography, particularly feathered serpents and ceremonial plazas, have led some to speculate about cultural diffusion between the two regions. While there's no direct evidence to definitively support the link, the mystery remains. How did a civilization in North America, without stone tools, the wheel, or beasts of burden, create urban centers rivaling their southern counterparts in complexity and symbolism? And then, as quickly as they rose, they were gone. By 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. The great mounds fell silent. Woodhenge rotted away, trade routes dissolved. What caused the sudden and irreversible decline? Environmental data suggests deforestation, flooding, and crop failures, perhaps exacerbated by drought. There are also signs of social unrest, evidence of violence, hastily built fortifications, and mass burials. Did the society collapse under its own weight? Was it famine, war, disease, or something else entirely? Some speculate that the abandonment may have been ritualistic, part of a cycle of renewal that we no longer understand. Others believe it was a gradual unraveling, undermined by environmental stress and internal conflict. And yet, some theorists point to deeper mysteries. They question whether the Mississippian civilization was part of a much older continuum, an echo of an even more ancient tradition, lost to time, a thread that briefly resurfaced before disappearing again beneath the surface of history. Adding to the intrigue is how Native American oral histories often skirt direct reference to Cahokia and its builders. Some traditions speak of great cities swallowed by time, of sky people, and of earth farmers. But no single tribe claims direct descent from the Cahokia mound builders. Was knowledge lost through generational trauma and colonial displacement? Or was the culture already shrouded in mystery, even to those who came after? Today, the great mounds stand like headstones to a vanished era, green, still massive. And while tourists wander the site and archaeologists continue their painstaking work, much of Cahokia remains unexcavated. Beneath the soil lie clues we have not yet found, and perhaps some we are not yet ready to understand. What knowledge guided the hands that built these monuments? What stories were whispered beneath the stars as Woodhenge cast its shadow? And why did they leave, never to return? The Mississippian civilization leaves us with more questions than answers, and in that silence there is something unsettling. Elam, a powerful yet forgotten empire, just beyond the dusty plains of southwestern Iran, where the Zagros Mountains rise like silent guardians against the horizon, lie the crumbled remnants of a forgotten empire. The sun casts long shadows across ancient foundations and broken reliefs, their lines weathered by time but still echoing with a faint, elusive memory. This is the land of Elam, a name barely spoken in most histories, but one that once inspired fear and fascination throughout the ancient Near East. The ruins of Susa, once the bustling Elamite capital, now lie buried under layers of sediment and silence. Yet beneath these ruins, a civilization older than Persia, older even than Babylon, patiently waits to be remembered. As early as 2700 BCE, the Elamites forged a sphere of influence that endured in some form for over 2,000 years. They traded with Sumer, warred with Akkad, and left behind temples, administrative tablets, and cryptic inscriptions. But despite this long presence, their voice in history remains muted. Who were the Elamites truly? And why does their story feel like a whisper in a room filled with louder, better-known empires? The Elamite language itself is a puzzle. It is not Semitic, not Indo-European. It belongs to no known language family. Despite countless attempts, no clear connection has ever been found between Elamite and any other language, ancient or modern. It stands alone, an island in a sea of tongues. What kind of people speak a language with no relatives? Were they the remnants of an even older civilization, a forgotten migration, or something more mysterious? Their writing system also evolved independently. While the Sumerians and Akkadians developed cuneiform for their needs, the Elamites initially created Proto-Elamite and then Linear Elamite, a rare, undeciphered script that remains one of the last uncracked codes of the ancient world. In recent years, scholars have made progress in interpreting its symbols. However, many of its texts still defy translation. What knowledge is hidden within these clay tablets? What stories remain locked behind these unread lines? Unlike their more monumental neighbors, the Elamites favored smaller, compact cities. Their temples were modest but intricate, their art distinctive, filled with geometric patterns, mythical beasts, and deities unlike those of Mesopotamia. Central to their belief system was the goddess Carisha, often referred to as the Great Lady. Beside her was Naparisha, the supreme god of the highlands. But even here, their religion stands apart, unique, regional, and difficult to place within broader mythological frameworks. What rituals were performed in their sanctuaries? What cosmology guided their rulers? One of the most striking aspects of Elamite culture is its role as both rival and enigma to Mesopotamia. To the Babylonians and Assyrians, Elam was a constant thorn in their side. Distant, powerful, unpredictable, Elamite armies marched on Susa, sacked cities, took kings captive, and even once stole the sacred statue of Marduk from Babylon itself. In turn, they were demonized in texts and cursed in myths. But why such animosity? Was it simply rivalry? Or did the Elamites hold on to something older, something more fearsome than what we now understand? Their art tells a quieter story. Elamite reliefs demonstrate exquisite technique, advanced metallurgy, and a striking attention to detail. At archaeological sites like Haftipo and Choga-Zanbil, we find ziggurats and burial complexes that rival the best structures of the time. The massive ziggurat of Choga-Zanbil, built by the Elamite king Untishnaparisha around 1250 BCE, remains one of the best preserved in the world, a testament to their engineering and religious devotion. Yet unlike Babylonian structures, the purpose of many of these Elamite monuments is still debated. Were they administrative centers, ritual complexes, or symbols of forgotten theological truths? Then there is the mystery of Elam's end. The empire's fall was not a single event, but a series of diminishments. By the 6th century BCE, the Elamites were absorbed into the rising Persian Achaemenid Empire. Their language faded, their gods were forgotten. Even their memory became warped, reduced to a name on tablets and occasional footnotes in the chronicles of others. Some scholars argue that Elam didn't collapse but rather quietly merged into Persia, becoming part of the new empire's cultural DNA. Others believe the disappearance was more deliberate, a suppression of a rival culture, or a slow erosion of a people whose roots were too different to assimilate. More speculative theories have also emerged. Some suggest that the Elamites held on to knowledge far older than their neighbors, a thread connecting them to prehistoric civilizations that may have existed long before recorded history. In this light, their unique language and isolated cultural traits might be remnants of a forgotten branch of early human settlement in the Fertile Crescent. Could they have been descendants of a primordial people whose memory is lost to time? To this day, the Elamite script still resists full translation. Their mythology remains fragmentary. Their history is more often told by those who oppose them than by their own voices. And their greatest monuments, like Choga-Zanbil, stand quietly under the sky, rarely visited, barely studied. What legacy lies buried beneath the dust of Susa? What truths are sealed within the unread tablets of linear Elamite? And why does this civilization, so long-lived, so distinct, remain one of the least understood? The Elamites may be gone, but their silence speaks. And in that silence lies the question, what if the oldest stories are the ones we've forgotten how to hear? Wari and Andean Empire's fading presence, high in the rugged highlands of central Peru, where the land cracks into steep valleys and the air carries the scent of stone and altitude, lie the fractured remnants of a forgotten capital city. Dust clings to the weathered blocks of massive walls, their corners, once meticulously fitted, now softened by centuries of silence. This is the city of Wari, and stone by stone, a civilization built in the clouds and then lost. Long before the Incas rose to power, long before their vast network of roads and temples stretched across South America, the Wari built an empire here, one of the first true imperial powers of the Andes. From roughly 600 to 1000 CE, they controlled a territory that stretched for hundreds of miles from modern-day Ayacucho to the distant Pacific coast, across desert, jungle, and mountain. And yet today, their name barely registers in popular memory. Who were the Wari? And why did a civilization so advanced, so organized, vanish with so few clues? The ruins of their capital city, near modern-day Ayacucho, hint at a society of remarkable complexity. The layout is grid-like, precise, an early testament to urban planning. Structures are built from finely cut stone and adobe bricks, forming courtyards, galleries, and ceremonial enclosures. There are subterranean chambers, ventilation systems, and hints of water management. Constructions that speak not just of practicality, but of a deeper, more symbolic order. At the heart of the Wari world was a mastery not just of space, but of people, resources, and belief. Unlike the more decentralized cultures that preceded them, the Wari developed a bureaucratic state, complete with administrative centers, storehouses, and outposts. They employed terraced agriculture to reshape hillsides and dry canal systems to irrigate arid valleys. At their peak, the Wari Empire may have provided a blueprint for the Incas, who later adopted similar methods of control and expansion. But despite these achievements, the Wari left no written language behind. Their stories were not recorded on scrolls or carved in stone. Only fragments survive. Intricate textiles, pottery adorned with geometric patterns and fierce deities, and bones buried deep within sealed chambers. Their iconography, rich and abstract, suggests a sophisticated cosmology, one where death, transformation, and duality played central roles. What gods did they worship? What rituals governed their lives? Perhaps the most unsettling discovery comes from the necropolises found throughout the Wari territory. Dozens of mummified remains, sometimes buried in fetal position, others placed in multi-tiered chambers with offerings and ceremonial vessels. Some tombs appear communal, suggesting a collective identity in death. But others, like those found at the site of Castillo de Warme, have revealed something more unexpected. An elite class of women adorned with gold and fine fabrics, buried with reverence. Were they priestesses, rulers, matriarchs of a forgotten dynasty? Mainstream archaeology suggests the Wari rose to power through a combination of diplomacy, military force, and religious influence. Their art spread over vast distances, and the evidence of centralized planning points to a highly organized state. Yet unlike empires that fell to conquest, the Wari did not end with a war. There was no dramatic collapse recorded in memory, only a slow, unexplained fading. By the 11th century, their cities were abandoned. Their infrastructure, roads, canals, temples, fell into disrepair. The central government dissolved. But why? Some scholars point to environmental stress, prolonged droughts that made agriculture unsustainable, particularly in the highlands. Others cite internal unrest or the overextension of administrative control. Nevertheless, the truth remains frustratingly unclear. No great fires marked in their cities. No mass burials speak of war. The Wari simply disappeared. And then there are the more speculative threads. Some researchers suggest that the Wari worldview may have been influenced by their own unraveling, that their system, deeply rooted in ritual and cyclical thinking, might have demanded periodic abandonment or transformation. That collapse in their context was not necessarily viewed as a failure, but as a transition. Others wonder if their disappearance was a form of deliberate retreat, where the society's elite chose to withdraw from centralized power into smaller, more ancestral groups to weather instability. A few fringe theories even suggest the Wari may have had contacts beyond the Andes. Comparisons have been drawn between their iconography and motifs found in distant Mesoamerican cultures. Could there have been a long-distance exchange of ideas, goods, or beliefs that mainstream history has yet to uncover? And what is their legacy? The Inca Empire, centuries later, rose in the same territory, adopting many of the same strategies: road networks, administrative centers, terraced agriculture. Some believe the Incas may have inherited more from the Wari than we realize, that the bones of their empire were already laid in the landscape. Yet even the Incas said little about them. Did they forget? Or did they deliberately erase the memory of a predecessor whose memory had power? Today, the Wari remain both present and absent, visible in their stones, their artifacts, their roads, but elusive in meaning. Without text, we are forced to interpret symbols, to read the language of layout, of color, of burial. And always, just beyond the edge of understanding, lies a sense of something deeper, something that refuses to be fully explained. What truths were woven into their silent textiles? What stories were sealed beneath the unexcavated soil of their cities? And why did one of the greatest empires of the Andes choose to fade into the shadows of history? The Wari built an empire without leaving a voice, and yet somehow their silence still speaks. The Indus Valley, civilization's unexplained silence. As the dust swirls across the parched plains of the Indus Valley, it settles around the ruins of a once great civilization. Crumbling walls of baked brick rise faintly from the earth, straight lines, right angles, and silent streets that have not echoed with footsteps for nearly 4,000 years. These are the remnants of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, ancient cities of the Indus Valley civilization. The grid patterns, the drainage systems, the uniform architecture all speak of an advanced society, meticulously ordered and deeply meaningful. But somewhere behind the crumbling foundations and unearthed artifacts stands a silence that has yet to be broken. A long silence, a dark age. Between 1900 and 1300 BCE, the world of Harappa dimmed. Cities emptied, writing ceased, craftsmanship declined, and the great Indus Valley civilization, which once spanned over 500,000 square miles from modern-day Pakistan to Western India, entered a period scholars now call the Harappan Dark Age. But what caused such a quiet and complete collapse of one of the world's earliest urban cultures? The facts are haunting in their precision. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, each city was a masterpiece of early urban planning. They had broad streets, sophisticated drainage systems, granaries and standardized weights and measures. They built without kings, palaces, or military monuments. Their script, still undeciphered, appears on seals, tablets, and pottery shards, hinting at a rich symbolic language we can no longer read. Then slowly, the structures ceased to be maintained. Bricks became brittle, the writing disappeared, and the once bustling cities dissolved into dust. Mainstream historians have proposed a number of plausible theories. Environmental changes play a large role. Geological evidence suggests rivers shifted course, particularly the drying up of the Ghaggar Hakra, often identified with the ancient Saraswati. As rivers moved, so too did the lifeblood of agriculture, trade, and urban life. Climate change also plays a part. Around the same time monsoon rains weakened, crops failed, and droughts lengthened. For a civilization built around water management and seasonal rhythms, this would have been catastrophic. But is that the whole story? Archaeological evidence doesn't show widespread warfare or invasion. There are no layers of burning corresponding to citywide destruction. Instead, we see a gradual decline, urban centers giving way to smaller, rural settlements. Was this a planned retreat, a cultural transformation, or something else entirely? The Harappan script remains one of the great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Without a Rosetta Stone to unlock its meaning, we are left with patterns and symbols: elephants, tigers, unicorns, ritual scenes. What were they trying to tell us? Were they economic records, sacred texts, royal decrees, or poetry? And what of the people themselves? Skeletal remains from later Harappan contexts show signs of stress, malnutrition, disease, and trauma, but they also hint at a multicultural population. Some researchers suggest that in the later phases, there was a mingling of groups, internal migrations, the integration of new communities. Was this a melting pot or a fracturing? Were these newcomers refugees, conquerors, or relatives? Among the most debated ideas is the proposed arrival of Indo-Aryan peoples into the subcontinent during or shortly after the decline. Some argue this wave brought Vedic traditions, replacing or absorbing the Harappan legacy. But others dispute the timing, pointing to continuities, that Harappan ideas, practices, and even elements of their language seeped quietly into later Indian culture. Could the Vedas themselves, the foundational spiritual texts of India, contain echoes of the Harappan worldview, masked by time and translation? Then there are the more speculative threads. Some point to the striking uniformity of the Indus cities, how bricks were made to a consistent ratio, how weights and measures were standardized across vast distances. What kind of government could coordinate such uniformity without visible kings, armies, or central temples? Was there a forgotten order, a council, a priesthood that ruled not by force but by systems? Others note the striking absence of ostentatious burial sites. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left no great tombs, no golden burials, no megalithic self-monuments. Were they egalitarian by design? Or was their wealth hidden in transient forms? Rituals, language, philosophy, now lost to stone? And what of the so-called Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro? This massive watertight structure, built of fired brick and sophisticated drainage, seems to have had ritual significance, but its exact purpose remains unclear. Was it a place of purification, a temple pool, or something more symbolic, perhaps a portal between worlds? The Harappan Dark Age is not just a mystery of loss, it is a mystery of silence, a society that seemed to function without warfare or tyranny, without elaborate self-aggrandizement, and yet achieved remarkable heights in engineering, sanitation, and trade, vanished, leaving behind only clues we are still learning to interpret. Today, the Indus Valley sites stand quietly under the heat. Excavations continue, but political borders, environmental challenges, and the sheer scale of the landscape slow the search. Meanwhile, the seals remain untranslated, the rivers dry, and the people unnamed. What wisdom was encoded in the Harappan script? What values allowed them to build such balanced, sustainable cities? And what broke that balance? And why, for all their brilliance, did they depart without a voice? Perhaps the answers lie buried in the alluvium, or perhaps they linger in the myths and memories of a land that still remembers, however faintly. The Greek Dark Ages, a period of obscurity. In the hills of the Peloponnese, scattered among olive groves and limestone cliffs, lie the ruins of once glorious cities, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos. Cyclopean walls built from massive stone blocks still stand in solemn defiance, their purpose long forgotten, their builders long vanished into the mists of time. Above them, the sky turns slowly over empty land, and the wind carries no voices. This is the silent heart of a forgotten age, a time between legends and history, between the fall of a civilization and the rise of a new world. This is the Greek Dark Ages. Around 1200 BCE, the palace centers of the Mycenaean world collapsed. The great citadels burned, writing disappeared, trade networks dissolved, and the vibrant, interconnected society of the Aegean Bronze Age descended into obscurity. What followed was a silence of almost 4 centuries, a time when the Greeks themselves seemed to forget who they were. But how can a world unravel so completely? Archaeological remnants of the late Bronze Age paint a picture of wealth and complexity. The Mycenaeans built fortified palace complexes, managed intricate bureaucratic systems, and maintained trade routes that stretched from Egypt to the Western Mediterranean. They left behind tablets inscribed in Linear B, administrative documents that reveal a tightly organized society, rich in agriculture, warfare, and ritual. Their cities were centers of culture and power. Then abruptly, nothing. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the tablets stopped being written. The palaces crumbled, burial customs changed, pottery became simpler. For nearly 400 years, from roughly 1100 to 750 BCE, the historical record goes dim. Greeks stopped writing, monumental architecture vanished, urban centers shrank or were abandoned entirely. Mainstream scholars suggest a confluence of catastrophes. Earthquakes may have crippled key cities. Invasions, perhaps by the mysterious Sea Peoples, may have overwhelmed fragile defenses. Internal rebellions, famine, and drought could have compounded the crisis. A once unified world may have been undone by its own complexity, its systems too fragile to withstand simultaneous shocks. And yet these explanations leave gaps. Why was the collapse so widespread? Why did it encompass the entire Aegean, affecting not just Greece but Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant? How did so many advanced societies fall almost simultaneously? And how did they all enter a prolonged silence? Some theorists suggest a more gradual cultural shift, a transformation rather than total collapse. They point to continuities in certain settlement patterns, to traditions that persisted even as the Mycenaean order faded. Were these truly dark ages, or a time of slow adaptation, of rebuilding social structures that would eventually lead to the emergence of the classical world? Others turn to legend. The Greek Dark Ages were fertile ground for stories. Oral tradition bloomed as the written word disappeared. Tales of gods and heroes, of Troy and the Odyssey, were passed down through generations. Homer's epics, though recorded centuries later, are believed to echo with memories of this lost world. Could the Iliad and the Odyssey be more than myth? Could they contain fragments of real events coded in poetry? There are hints, too, in the material culture. At sites like Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, archaeologists have uncovered unusually rich burials from the so-called Dark Period. One tomb contains a man and woman buried together, the man cremated, the woman inhumed, a ritual combination not seen before. Nearby, the remnants of a large wooden structure suggest communal gatherings or ritual use. Was Lefkandi a hidden center of continuity? A glimpse of an elite culture that survived in the shadows? And what of the strange arrival of iron? The transition from bronze to iron occurred during this period, but not as a technological revolution, but rather a quiet, almost reluctant shift. Bronze had dominated for centuries, dependent on tin and copper from distant lands. As trade collapsed, access to tin dwindled. Iron, though harder to work, became the metal of necessity. This material transformation changed warfare, economy, and society. Was it a cause of the collapse or a symptom? A myriad of fringe theories abound. Some suggest a cometary impact, pointing to sudden climate anomalies and global disruptions. Others propose lost knowledge, deliberately suppressed or destroyed, that once guided the palace societies. Some even question whether the Mycenaeans were the true originators of their civilization, or if they inherited something older. Now entirely lost, but what is perhaps most mysterious is what followed. By the 8th century BCE, something stirred again in the Greek world. An alphabet emerged, borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. Cities began to grow. Temples rose. Sculpture and pottery became expressive, intricate, and with it came a new identity, the birth of the polis, the rise of citizenship, the spark of philosophy. Out of the silence, a renaissance was born, yet the centuries in between remained dim. Who kept the stories alive in those quiet generations? What was remembered and what was lost? Did cultural memory linger beneath the ashes of the palaces, whispered around campfires until it took shape in verse? The Greek Dark Ages remain a chasm in our understanding, too developed to ignore, too fragmentary to fully explain. And in that chasm lies the question, how much of a civilization can disappear before we forget it ever existed? The Bronze Age collapse, a world crumbles. As the sun sets over the eastern Mediterranean, it casts long golden shadows across broken stones and half-buried temples. These are the remnants of a vanished world. Cities once lit by oil lamps, bustling with scribes, merchants, kings, and priests. Now only fragments remain, shattered tablets, crumbled palaces, scorched layers in the earth. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, a great silence fell. Across 3 continents, the lights of civilization flickered and went out. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a moment in history so vast, so sudden, and so devastating that it still baffles historians. In the centuries leading up to the collapse, the ancient world flourished. The new kingdom of Egypt stood as a beacon of power. The Hittites ruled Anatolia. The Mycenaeans held sway in Greece. Canaanite city-states traded throughout the Levant. And the mighty kingdom of Ugarit hummed with diplomatic correspondence and commercial ambition. These societies were bound together by a complex web of trade, politics, and shared knowledge. Tin and copper moved across deserts and seas to forge bronze. Spices, textiles, and grain changed hands in a dense network that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Then one by one, the great cities fell. At Ugarit, clay tablets holding desperate pleas for help were left in kilns that were never opened. At Mycenae, the palaces burned and were never rebuilt. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned, swallowed by the mountains. In Egypt, the pharaoh Ramesses III fended off invasions by mysterious outsiders, peoples without names arriving by both land and sea. These were the Sea Peoples, as Egyptian inscriptions would later call them. But who were they? Mainstream theories try to sketch the outlines of this collapse. Climate change leading to prolonged droughts and famine, earthquakes toppling cities, waves of migration disrupting a fragile balance. There is evidence for all of these. Grain records from Egypt show sharp shortages. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, suggests sudden climate shifts, and archaeological layers across the region show signs of destruction, abandonment, or abrupt cultural change. And yet no single explanation seems sufficient. How could so many sophisticated societies, each with their own strengths, armies, economies, and infrastructure, fall together within a single human lifetime? The Sea Peoples remain one of the most tantalizing mysteries of this era. Egyptian reliefs depict chaotic naval battles, foreign warriors in feathered helmets and strange armor storming the delta. Were they displaced tribes fleeing climatic disaster? Mercenaries turning on their employers? Or agents of a deeper disruption, perhaps driven by hunger, desperation, or ideology? Some historians suggest the very complexity of the Late Bronze Age world made it vulnerable. As cities became more interconnected, they also became more interdependent. A disruption in one region, a failed harvest, piracy, the collapse of a trade route, could send ripples throughout the entire system. When trade slowed, bronze production stalled. When economies faltered, the palace economies unraveled. Did the collapse begin not with war, but with a silence of missed shipments, unfilled contracts, and silenced markets? Others propose that internal unrest played a crucial role. At several sites, such as Mycenae in Greece, there are signs of social upheaval, hastily built fortifications, elites buried in hurried graves, visible destruction of central authority. Could the collapse have been, at least in part, a series of revolutions? Were peasants and laborers rising up against the palace order? And others ask darker questions. What if the collapse was not simply a reaction to crisis, but a deliberate destruction? Could there have been ideological movements, religious or political, that sought to dismantle the old order rather than preserve it, where temples and archives burned not by accident, but by design? Then comes the archaeological silence. After the collapse, writing disappeared in many regions. Monumental buildings ceased. Long-distance trade dramatically reduced. In Greece, the linear B script vanished, and it would be centuries before a new script emerged. In the Levant, new cultures arose on the ruins of the old, but with less grandeur, smaller settlements, and fewer connections. It was a time of survivors. And yet, not all was lost. Some knowledge endured. The spread of iron began, perhaps first in Anatolia, where the Hittites had experimented with the metal, and then throughout the wider Mediterranean. Simpler, more decentralized societies took root. Oral traditions preserved memories of the old world. In time, new civilizations arose from the ashes. The Neo-Hittites, the Phrygians, from the silence in Greece, the city-states of the Archaic period, and in Canaan, the small, once marginal tribes who would become the Israelites. Nevertheless, the Bronze Age collapse remains a mystery. How could such an advanced world vanish with such suddenness? What role did drought, warfare, migration, and ideology play? And who were the Sea Peoples truly? Invaders, refugees, or harbingers of a deeper reckoning? We excavate, we analyze, we theorize. But much of this ancient unraveling remains beneath the earth, beyond translation, beyond certainty. What knowledge disappeared when the tablets stopped being written? What truths are buried within the crumbled palaces and unnamed graves of the Late Bronze Age? Perhaps the collapse was not the end of an era, but the erasure of a question we still don't know how to ask. The sack of Rome by the Gauls, a traumatic turning point. As the early morning mist curls through the valleys of central Italy, it drifts over the low-lying hills of a city not yet destined for empire. Rome, before the marble, before the empire, before Caesar, was a city of adobe houses, narrow streets, and wooden fortifications. In 390 BCE, or perhaps 387, depending on the source, this still young republic faced a terror it would never forget, not from Carthage, not from its own senate, but from the north, from a people the Romans called the Gauls. What followed were centuries that left a scar on Roman memory. The first sack of Rome, a moment when the eternal city nearly ceased to be, before its long rise had truly begun. It began with the Battle of the Allia, north of the city, where a Roman army met a migrating band of Senoan Gauls, led by a chieftain named Brennus. According to ancient sources, the encounter was sudden, chaotic. Roman formations collapsed under the wild fury of the Gauls. The defeat was so crushing, so humiliating, that the Romans ever after considered the date of the battle, July 18th, cursed, a day of ill omen for generations to come. The survivors fled. The city lay open. What happened next became a fog of fear and legend. The Gauls entered Rome. They looted and burned. According to Livy, the sacred geese of Juno warned the defenders on the Capitoline Hill of a night attack, saving the little that remained. And yet much of Rome was reduced to smoldering ruins, temples desecrated, archives lost, statues shattered. Rome's early history, perhaps even much of its foundational narrative, was literally burned to the ground. But how much of this story is true? Here the sources diverge. The accounts we have, primarily from Livy, Polybius, and Plutarch, were written centuries later, influenced by Rome's later grandeur and the need for myth. Livy describes a dramatic standoff. After months of siege, the Romans agree to pay a ransom in gold. But when they protest the Gauls' use of false weights, Brennus throws his sword onto the scales, uttering the infamous phrase, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. It is an iconic moment. But was it real, or a fiction created by a Rome that needed to remember defeat heroically? No single archaeological layer definitively confirms a widespread sack of Rome in 390 BCE. There is some evidence of destruction, but it is fragmentary. Possible fires, disruptions in building patterns, signs of abrupt abandonment. Yet the material silence is striking. If the city was truly wiped clean, why is the destruction so difficult to trace? Some historians suggest the sack may have been exaggerated or even partly fabricated. A lesser raid or diplomatic standoff later amplified into legendary catastrophe. Others suggest the opposite, that it was even worse than the sources claim. But the chaos and disorganization of early Rome left little record to preserve the truth. After all, the Roman Republic at that time had no monumental stone architecture. Much of the city was built of wood and mud brick, easily destroyed and easily forgotten. And what of the Gauls themselves? To the Romans, they were barbarians, savage, wild, driven by plunder. But the Sanonese were part of a complex Celtic world that stretched from Gaul to the Danube, with their own culture, craftsmanship, and martial traditions. Their invasion of Italy was not random. It was part of a larger wave of migration and pressure, perhaps driven by demographic shifts or the struggle for land. Were they invaders or refugees, opportunists or victims of deeper continental upheavals? Some fringe theories even suggest a more unsettling possibility, that the Gauls were not merely raiders, but messengers of a broken system, the remnants of another collapsing order, an echo of the broader instability of the post-Bronze Age Mediterranean. A ripple effect, long delayed, reaching the heart of the Italian peninsula. In the years that followed the sack, the Romans rebuilt quickly. They erected new fortifications, restructured the city, and enacted laws to prevent such a disorderly state in the future. But the trauma remained. Rome's obsession with discipline, order, and military readiness, the hallmarks of its future empire, may have been born out of this single wound. Even centuries later, Roman generals would invoke the sack of Rome as a cautionary tale. It became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that even the mighty can fall. Yet many questions linger. What truly happened in those days when Rome was aflame? How much of our understanding is shaped by myth, by pride, by fear? And what truths might still be hidden in the ashes, beneath the forum, beneath the foundations of an empire? The sack of Rome by the Gauls marks a turning point not just in history, but in memory. A moment when a city was nearly erased, and in that near erasure, discovered what it needed to become. But behind the legend, the history still smolders, and perhaps somewhere beneath the stones, the truth still waits to be uncovered. The early Slavs, a mysterious and unseen migration. As winter recedes from the vast plains of Eastern Europe, the landscape begins to breathe. Forests open to winding rivers reflecting the pale sky, and the wind carries the faint scent of pine and thawed earth. These are lands where unknown tribes once walked, quiet settlements by lakes, modest tools left buried in the soil, and whispered songs now lost to time. It is here, between the Carpathians and the Baltic, in the deep heart of early Europe, that the story of the Slavs begins, or rather, where it disappears. The early Slavic migrations are not recorded in ink, but etched into the shifting soil of forgotten graves and scattered pottery shards. Between the 5th and 7th centuries CE, a quiet expansion unfolded across the continent, sudden in its breadth, yet frustratingly opaque. A people without cities, without stone monuments, and without a native writing system spread out over thousands of miles. From the cold bogs of Polisia to the warm valleys of the Balkans, the Slavs moved. But who were they before they moved? And why does their early history remain so difficult to trace? Before the Great Migrations, the Slavs are almost invisible in the historical record. Classical authors say little. Tacitus, Pliny, Ptolemy, they mention names like the Veneti or the Sclaveni, but with uncertainty, confusion, and generic descriptions. These early references are sparse, scattered, and often based on second-hand accounts. No Slavic texts remain from this time, no stone inscriptions, no chronicles. And yet, archaeologically, something shifts. Around the 5th century CE, distinct cultural patterns begin to emerge. Pottery styles, house constructions, and burial customs that suggest a shared identity, even if the name Slavs would be applied later. Small villages appear in the Pripet marshes and along the upper Dnieper, built not for defense but for sustenance. There is little gold, no grand temples, just modest dwellings, simple tools, and scattered signs of ritual. What prompted their sudden movement? Mainstream theories suggest a combination of demographic pressure, environmental shifts, and the vacuum left by collapsing Roman and Gothic frontiers. The world was in motion. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, the Huns had come and gone, Germanic tribes were relocating, and the borders, once rigid, blurred. Into this chaotic landscape, the Slavs expanded. They crossed rivers, scaled mountains, and entered lands once ruled by emperors and kings. In some places, they settled peacefully. In others, they clashed with lingering imperial forces. Byzantine chroniclers, writing in Constantinople, reported on Slavic raids along the Danube. Swift and numerous, seeping through defenses like water through broken stone. But were they invaders or settlers? Raiders or refugees? The picture becomes more complex with every excavation in Bulgaria, Romania, and the former Yugoslav lands. The material culture of the Slavs blends with that of other peoples. There are signs of assimilation, of syncretism, pagan rituals alongside Christian icons, local pottery modified by foreign hands. Was this a mixing of cultures or a quiet erasure of those who came before? Some scholars argue that the early Slavs may have been less a single ethnic group than a fluid confederation, bound by language and shared customs, but not yet a defined people. Others suggest the Slavs had long existed in the shadows of larger civilizations, the Scythians, the Goths, the Sarmatians, and only emerged into the light when those shadows lifted. And then there are the riddles that defy easy classification, the striking unity of the Slavic languages. Despite a vast geographical spread, the basic grammar and structure of Slavic tongues suggest a relatively recent divergence. How could a people spread from the Adriatic to the Volga, from the Elbe to the Aegean, in such a short time and maintain such linguistic coherence? Was their migration faster than we assume? Or were they already more widespread before history noticed them? Fringe theories abound. Some suggest the Slavs were descendants of ancient Indo-European groups who remained hidden or unnoticed by classical observers. Others propose that their movement was sparked by an environmental disaster, a plague, a drought, or a volcanic winter, leading to a cultural migration that left little trace. There are even whispers among the more speculative-minded of lost Slavic kingdoms, proto-states that rose and fell without leaving written records. Oral traditions speak of vanished leaders, buried cities, and battles found in no chronicle. Could there have been forgotten centers of Slavic power, obscured by time and conquest? Whatever their origins, the early Slavs reshaped the map of Europe. Within a few centuries, they formed kingdoms: Great Moravia, Kievan Rus, the Bulgarian Empire. They adopted Christianity, developed alphabets, and became the bedrock of modern Slavic nations. But their earliest chapter, the moment before memory, remains one of the least understood migrations in recorded history. What songs were sung before they crossed the Danube? What gods watched over their forest altars, now lost beneath fields and cities? And how many stories remain untold, hidden in the soil, waiting to be found? The Slavs moved not with monuments, but with memory, and in their silence the land still echoes with questions. The time of troubles, Russia's era of chaos. As the morning mist curls around the spires of a half-burned monastery, a cold wind sweeps across a land scarred by chaos. The rivers of Western Russia, once the lifeblood of trade and faith, now carry the silence of desolation. Villages lie in ruin, fields rot untended. The bells of Moscow toll not for celebration, but for alarm. This was the time of troubles, a chapter in Russian history as strange as it was violent. A time not just of political collapse, but of something deeper, more elusive, a fracturing of reality itself. This period, roughly from 1598 to 1613, began with the death of Tsar Fyodor I, the last of the Rurik dynasty. His passing meant not just the end of a bloodline, but the unraveling of a world. The Russian state, already weakened by famine and internal strife, fractured. The heavens darkened with omens, an unrelenting famine between 1601 and 1603 that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Crops failed. Cannibalism was whispered behind closed doors. The sun seemed weaker. The seasons became confused. And with the silence of nature came the human noise, desperation, betrayal, and war. But how did a powerful kingdom unravel so suddenly and descend into a maelstrom of impostors, invasions, and ghostly claims to the throne? The first false Dmitri emerged in 1604, claiming to be the younger son of Ivan the Terrible, long believed to have been murdered as a child. This enigmatic figure appeared from Poland, speaking fluent Russian and possessing the manners of nobility. Thousands believed him. The Orthodox Church wavered. Boyars hungry for power backed him. Even Tsarina Maria, the mother of the real Dmitri, reportedly confirmed his identity. But who was he truly? Was he the runaway monk Grigory Otrepyev, as the official history claims? A Polish pawn sent to sow discord? Or something stranger, an opportunist who tapped into the collective guilt and yearning of a nation? He entered Moscow in triumph. He married a Polish noblewoman, and within a year he was dead, thrown from a window, his body desecrated, his name cursed. Yet even that did not close the wound. Two more men would rise, both claiming to be the resurrected Dmitri. The second false Dmitri was said to wear a mask. He traveled with an army of mercenaries, his face known only in shadow. A third appeared further south near Pskov, leading Cossacks and gathering followers. Each commanded belief, at least from some. Each fueled the chaos. But how could three different men, within a few short years, convince thousands they were a dead Tsarevich? Were they simply imposters, or did the people want to believe? Was Russia's trauma so deep that it conjured its own ghost? Amidst the confusion, foreign powers intervened. Polish forces occupied Moscow. The Swedes marched on Novgorod. The boyar class, once the backbone of Russian nobility, fractured into factions, some seeking Polish crowns, others yearning for order at any cost. For a time, the Russian throne stood empty, or worse, occupied by foreign hands. Then came the whispers, quiet, unsettling. Peasants spoke of churches desecrated, not by soldiers, but by unseen forces. Monasteries struck by sudden fires, storms arriving without wind. In letters and records, priests spoke of a moral decay so profound it seemed unnatural, as though the very earth had turned against its people. And always the question lingered, what curse had been unleashed with the death of Fyodor? Some scholars, viewing through the lens of modernity, point to the eruption of the Peruvian volcano Huayna Putina in 1600 as a cause of the famine. The eruption was massive, its ash cloud altering global climate. Crop failures were recorded as far away as China. But could atmospheric ash account for the madness, the imposters, the eerie repetition of a dead boy's name? Others suggest the time of troubles was an inevitable collapse of a fragile autocracy. Overstretched by expansion, undermined by elite rivalries. But even that leaves much unexplained. The sheer surrealism of the era, three Dimitris, foreign czars in the Kremlin, boyars turning against their own, in a church that seemed adrift, feels like more than politics. It feels like metaphysics. And perhaps that is why, even after order was restored with the election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613, the memory of the Troubles lingered like a fevered dream. Russia survived, but it was changed. It had glimpsed something, an abyss of self-forgetting, a convulsion of identity. What does it mean when a nation forgets its rulers, believes the dead have returned, and invites foreign kings to take its throne? What shadow passed over Russia in those years? And why does it still echo in its literature, its folklore, its silences? The time of troubles left few monuments, but in the soul of the nation, a scar remained, and somewhere beneath the ashes of famine, fire, and fear, the truth may still be waiting. The Etruscans, a brilliant culture's lost voice. North of Rome, in the rolling landscapes of Tuscany, the earth breathes an ancient silence. Olive groves now cover the ruins of forgotten cities. Stone tombs are scattered across the landscape, half swallowed by the earth, their entrances dark and cool, undisturbed for centuries. Inside, painted walls tell stories no living voice remembers, scenes of feasting, dancers, journeys to the underworld, and strange rituals frozen in faded reds and ochres. These are the remnants of the Etruscans, a people whose brilliance helped shape the rise of Rome, but whose origins and disappearance remain shrouded in mystery. Before Rome was an empire, before Latin filled the streets of Italy, the Etruscans held sway over this land. From the 8th to the 3rd century BCE, they flourished in a confederation of city-states, Tarquinia, Veii, Chiusi, each with its own government, but united by a shared culture, language, and belief. They built roads and aqueducts, developed advanced metallurgy, and traded with the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians. Their ships sailed the Tyrrhenian Sea. Their artisans crafted exquisite bronze mirrors, cast intricate jewelry, and painted elaborate frescoes. And yet, for all their sophistication, the Etruscans remain largely unknown. The Roman historian Livy wrote of their kings. Virgil placed them among the noble warriors of ancient Italy. But most of what we know, or think we know, comes not from their own words, but from those who replaced them. For while the Etruscans left behind temples, tombs, and treasures, their writing, though partially deciphered, remains stubbornly opaque. Why, after centuries of power and innovation, did their voice fade? Etruscan inscriptions appear on tombs, mirrors, and ceramic artifacts, written in a script adapted from the Greek. And yet the language is a linguistic isolate, with no clear connection to any known Indo-European language. We can read the letters but often not understand the meaning. It is as if the Etruscans are speaking to us from the other side of a wall, audible but unintelligible. Some mainstream scholars suggest the Etruscans evolved from the Iron Age Villanovan culture of Italy, developing organically from local roots. Others, drawing on the writings of Herodotus, propose an Eastern origin, that they arrived by sea from Lydia in Asia Minor, fleeing famine or war, settling in Italy generations before Rome was founded. Still others entertain a more speculative possibility, that the Etruscans were remnants of an even older, pre-Indo-European Mediterranean civilization, existing long in the shadow of the Aegean world. Could they have been cultural survivors of the mysterious sea peoples, or distant relatives of the Minoans, pushed westward after the Bronze Age collapse? We may never know, but the material culture they left behind speaks of a people both worldly and deeply spiritual. Etruscan religion was complex, filled with deities, omens, and sacred rituals. They believed in a fixed cosmic order revealed in the signs of nature. Diviners, known as haruspices, foretold the future from the entrails of sacrificed animals or the patterns of lightning. This deep fascination with destiny and celestial messages would later impress the Romans, who adopted many Etruscan religious practices into their state cults. And then there are the tombs. Some of the most detailed records of Etruscan life come from the necropolises, entire cities of the dead carved into hillsides or built from stone. Inside, we find scenes of daily life and death, of joy and sorrow, of dancing and darkness. But one question lingers. Why did a culture so concerned with the afterlife disappear so completely? By the 4th century BCE, the Etruscans were in decline, under pressure from external enemies, the Celts from the north, the Greeks from the south, and an increasingly ambitious Rome. They slowly lost territory. In 396 BCE, the Roman conquest of Veii marked a turning point. Over the next 2 centuries, Etruscan cities fell one by one. Some capitulated, others resisted, only to be absorbed, and yet they did not vanish overnight. Their blood flowed into Rome. Etruscan engineers laid the foundations for the city's early infrastructure. Etruscan symbols like the fax, the bundle of rods symbolizing authority, were adopted by Roman magistrates. Even Rome's earliest kings, according to tradition, were Etruscan. Nevertheless, their culture eroded. Their language ceased to be spoken. Their temples were rededicated to Roman gods. Their names faded from memory. And perhaps this is the most enigmatic part. How does a civilization so closely linked to the rise of one of history's greatest empires vanish so quietly? Were they suppressed by force or by assimilation? Did they lose their identity or choose to shed it? Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover new tombs and inscriptions. Every discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the core remains elusive. Who were the Etruscans truly? And what did they believe about the world, about death, about themselves? Perhaps one day the key will be found, a complete text, a bilingual inscription, a buried archive. Or perhaps, like the people themselves, their secrets will remain just out of reach. A civilization known not by its words but by the silence it left behind. The Tokarians, European features in ancient Asia. In the vast windswept basin of the Taklamakan Desert, where China's modern Xinjiang region meets the ancient roots of the Silk Road, the land is silent, dry, and blindingly bright under the sun. Here, buried beneath layers of sand and time, archaeologists have uncovered something utterly unexpected. Astonishingly well-preserved mummies, with pale skin, long limbs, and hair the color of fire. Dressed in woolen clothes woven in patterns more reminiscent of Bronze Age Europe than Central Asia, they lie in wooden coffins adorned with geometric designs. These are the ancient Tokarians, an enigma in the heart of the East. Who were they? And how did a people with apparent European features and an Indo-European language come to reside in one of Asia's most remote corners? The mystery begins with the mummies, some dating back as far as 1800 BCE. Found near sites like Shaohe and Karagol, they are remarkably preserved by the arid climate. The bodies are not embalmed, but they lie in their burial garments, complete with boots, hats, and even cosmetics. Some are wrapped in woolen cloaks and tartan-like fabrics that seem to echo patterns once woven in distant lands of the Celts or Scythians. Yet these mummies are centuries older than those cultures. Later in desert cities like Kucha and Turpan, documents were found written in a now extinct language known as Tokarian, an eastern branch of the Indo-European family, related not to the neighboring Chinese or Turkic languages, but to Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. 2 dialects have been identified, Tokarian A and Tokarian B, written in a variant of the Brahmi script used throughout South Asia. The texts, dating from the 6th to 8th centuries CE, include Buddhist sutras, administrative records, and medical treatises. But by then, the Tokarians themselves were already fading. What we know is fragmentary. The Tokarians were part of a mosaic of cultures that inhabited the Tarim Basin, trading, translating, and transmitting knowledge between East and West. They built temples, carved cave sanctuaries, and left behind vibrant frescoes depicting their lives and beliefs, often featuring distinct European features, dressed in flowing robes, surrounded by Buddhist iconography. Mainstream theories suggest the Tokarians were an eastern wave of Indo-European migrations, part of the great dispersal that shaped much of Eurasian prehistory. But how they ended up here, isolated in the deserts of far western China, remains unclear. Most Indo-European groups moved west, towards Europe, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. The Tokarians seem to have gone the other way. Why? Some propose a slow, step-by-step drift, a chain of pastoral communities moving steadily eastward over centuries. Others point to possible connections with the Afanasevo culture of southern Siberia, known for its early Indo-European traits, but no definitive link exists. The Tokarians appear abruptly, fully formed, in one of the world's harshest environments, and then disappear just as mysteriously. What compelled them to settle here, between the desert and the mountains, thousands of miles from their linguistic relatives? Their culture also defies easy categorization. They adopted Buddhism, but their earlier beliefs remain elusive. Their art borrows from India and Persia, but their language carries echoes of a much older European tongue. They traded with Chinese dynasties, but maintained their distinct identity for centuries. Some of their frescoes depict knights with swords, elaborate courtly scenes, and funeral processions more reminiscent of Greco-Roman or Scythian art than anything traditionally East Asian. Could they have carried forgotten mythologies with them across the steppes? Were they keepers of knowledge now lost, traditions that once flowed along a trans-Eurasian network but were broken by time? More speculative theories exist. Some suggest the Tokarians were descendants of a prehistoric migration from the west, perhaps related to the ancient Anatolians or Achaeans, pushed eastward by warfare or climate change. Others see them as the remnants of a civilization erased by the shifting sands of both geography and empire. Their disappearance coincides with the rise of Turkic powers in the region and the spread of Islam along the Silk Road. Within a few generations, the Tokarian language and identity were erased, absorbed or replaced by new cultural waves. And yet the mummies remain, their faces serene, their clothes intact, their bodies curled as if they are merely asleep. What do they remember that we have forgotten? What stories were told in their language, now unread and barely understood? And how did a people from the far reaches of the Indo-European world leave their mark on the very edge of China? The Tokarians challenge our notions of migration, identity, and memory. They are a riddle in the desert, half buried beneath the salt and sand. And somewhere, perhaps, the wind still carries the whispers of their lost words. Axum, an African empire's quiet retreat. High in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, where the red earth meets the sky in jagged silhouettes, a quiet city of stone still stands. Carved obelisks rise solemnly from the landscape, tall, monolithic, and impossibly precise. Some stand over 70 feet high, adorned with intricate false doors and windows, as if mimicking the houses of the living for the benefit of the dead. These are the stelae of Axum, markers of a civilization once mighty, whose influence stretched across seas and centuries, and whose decline remains shrouded in silence. The kingdom of Axum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. At its peak, between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, it was an empire of merchants, warriors, and scribes, a bridge between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Axumite merchants traded in ivory, gold, frankincense, and slaves, sending goods across the Red Sea to Rome, Persia, and India. Their coins, among the earliest in sub-Saharan Africa, bore the likenesses of kings and the crosses of a newly adopted Christianity. Greek ge'ez and South Arabian inscriptions flowed through its courts and markets. The empire was literate, cosmopolitan, and ambitious, and then it vanished. By the 8th century, Axum had largely disappeared from international maps and texts. Its cities declined. Its port of Adulis, once a bustling hub of Red Sea trade, faded into obscurity. The great stelae, once symbols of royal power, had toppled or were buried by time and earth. What happened? Mainstream historians point to several factors. One was the rise of Islam. As Islamic caliphates rapidly spread across the Arabian Peninsula and along the Red Sea coast in the 7th century, trade networks shifted. New Muslim merchants favored ports under Islamic rule. Axum, now a Christian kingdom in a region turning Islamic, became increasingly isolated from its former economic arteries. There is also evidence of environmental change. Pollen records and sediment studies suggest a picture of deforestation, soil depletion, and possibly climate fluctuations. If crop yields declined, the population may have shifted inland, leaving behind the lowland trade centers for more sustainable agriculture in the highlands. Drought and land overuse could have slowly choked the empire from within. However, these explanations, while logical, don't fully account for the scale and speed of Axum's retreat from the global stage. Some suggest internal instability played a role: succession crises, religious disagreements, or civil unrest. Christianity, introduced in the 4th century under King Azana, had become deeply woven into Axumite identity. But could rival religious movements have fractured the state from within? Archaeological evidence is sparse, offering only scattered hints. Churches rebuilt as fortresses, abrupt shifts in settlement patterns, sacred inscriptions left unfinished. Others turn to more speculative theories. One such theory involves a mysterious shift of the Axumite capital. Around the 7th or 8th century, the center of political life appears to have moved southward, into the highlands, eventually leading to the emergence of the Zagwe dynasty. But no royal decree, no inscription, no chronicle explains this shift. Was it driven by necessity, ideology, or something more enigmatic? Was the heart of the kingdom willingly abandoned or lost to an unknown catastrophe? Then there are the legends, the whispers of Ethiopian tradition, suggesting a more deliberate concealment. Some tales speak of sacred relics moved and hidden in the mountains, of a holy duty bestowed upon a new line of rulers. Could the fall of Axum have been in part a retreat into secrecy, a cultural transformation masked as a decline? And what of the stelae? Their purpose remains unclear. While often described as grave markers, many have no burial chambers beneath them. Some are erected over empty pits or collapsed tunnels. Were they purely symbolic? Did they mark tombs now looted or relocated? Or did they serve a spiritual or cosmological role, aligning with the stars, channeling something older than memory? The inscriptions that do survive offer little clarity. They celebrate victories, kingship, in the favor of God, but they end abruptly. There is no definitive proclamation, no lament for a fading empire. Today, the legacy of Axum still resonates. Its language, Ge'ez, survives in the liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Its crosses are carved into the rock-hewn churches throughout the Ethiopian highlands, and its stories are preserved, layered into Ethiopia's cultural memory. But the reasons for its decline remain elusive. Why did one of the most advanced kingdoms of its time, connected to Rome, India, and Byzantium, retreat into isolation? Why did its coinage, once used throughout the Red Sea, vanish from circulation? And what knowledge was lost when Axumite scribes put down their styluses and its stelae fell silent? The stones of Axum still stand, and in their shadow the mystery of a vanished empire lingers, quietly waiting to be heard. The Sogdians, masters of Asia's trade routes. As the sun rises over the steppes of Central Asia, it casts long golden shadows across the ruins of Samarkand. The silence here is broken only by the wind, dry, whispering, as if carrying fragments of forgotten voices. Among the crumbling walls and faded frescoes lie clues to a civilization once known not for conquest, but for connection. Merchants, translators, artisans, and envoys. These were the Sogdians, the lifeblood of the Silk Road, who linked empires from China to Byzantium. And yet today, they are largely forgotten. Who were these people who etched their stories into the very arteries of Asia and then vanished without a sound? From the 6th century BCE to the 11th century CE, the Sogdians flourished in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Panjakent, were vibrant centers of trade and culture. They spoke an East Iranian language, wrote in an alphabet derived from Aramaic, and practiced diverse religions: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and later Nestorian Christianity, a testament to their pluralistic and adaptable identity. But their greatest legacy was not carved in stone or recorded in scriptures. It was movement. Sogdian merchants moved silk, horses, spices, and precious metals along the Silk Road. They traveled farther than most traders of the era, establishing diaspora communities in Chinese cities like Chang'an and Luoyang, where they served as translators, artists, and intermediaries between East and West. Their letters, discovered in a ruined watchtower near Dunhuang, tell of distant families, fluctuating prices, and the dangers of the road. Bandits, political unrest, betrayal. These are not imperial chronicles. They are human records, fragments of lives lived in motion. But even as their networks grew, their political identity remained elusive. The Sogdians never built an empire of their own. They lived within the bounds of larger powers, under the Achaemenids, the Kushans, the Hephthalites, the Turks, and then the Arabs and the Mongols. And yet, while being ruled, they profoundly influenced. Their language became the lingua franca of the Silk Road. Their script appeared on treaties, religious texts, and cave paintings from Central Asia to northern China. How could a people without armies wield such power across continents? Some historians suggest the Sogdians' power came not from conquest, but from trust. Their merchants, often traveling in extended kinship networks, navigated cultural boundaries with ease. They could adapt to local customs, learn new languages, and shift religious identities without losing their core. This cultural flexibility made them indispensable to empires and essential for merchants, monks, and migrants alike. Yet despite all their influence, there are gaps in their story. We have no grand Sogdian chronicle, no national epic, no single monument. Much of what we know is gleaned from fragments, scattered manuscripts, buried coins, wall paintings preserved in dry cave cities like Panjakent, or from foreign records that mention them in passing. It is as if they were always present, but always on the periphery. Why? Perhaps their strength and diversity was also their vulnerability. Their cities were open, their beliefs varied, their loyalties often pragmatic. As the Abbasid Caliphate rose in the 8th century, the Islamic world slowly absorbed the Sogdian trade routes. Arabic replaced Sogdian as the language of commerce. Their religious pluralism became suspect in a world moving towards doctrinal unity, and in time, their identity dissolved, replaced by new powers, new languages, and new faiths. But the unresolved questions remain. Why, after centuries of significance, did they leave so little record of themselves? Was it humility or a deliberate choice? Could the Sogdians have held on to knowledge now lost, coded within documents that are yet to be found beneath the desert sands? Some scholars suggest the Sogdians were not merely merchants, but keepers of ancient traditions, carriers of spiritual texts, oral histories, and forgotten cosmologies. In the Buddhist caves of Dunhuang, Sogdian scribes appear alongside Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit monks. In the Manichaean texts found in Western China, Sogdian is the preferred language of believers. Their artistic motifs, celestial dancers, sacred trees, winged figures, hint at mythologies we no longer fully understand. Were they mediators not just of goods, but of beliefs? And then there are the frescoes of Panjakent. Vibrant, alive, and expressive, they depict scenes of feasting and battle, of gods and demons, of daily life and epic fantasy. Some are reminiscent of Persian epics, others of Indian cosmologies. Some remain utterly unique. Who were these figures painted on plaster so many centuries ago? Were they heroes of forgotten tales, or echoes of a mythical past stretching far beyond Rome or China? The Sogdians remain a paradox, central to history, yet recorded on its margins. They shaped the Silk Road, but left no stone monument in their own name. They spoke a language now dead, but once known from Antioch to Xi'an. What else might lie beneath the ruins of Samarkand, hidden in the cracks of trade tunnels, or in the folds of ancient scrolls? What might we learn if we could hear their voices again? Not through the writings of others, but in their own words. The winds of Central Asia still pass over the bones of Sogdian cities, and somewhere in that shifting dust, their story waits, unfinished. The Nabataeans, desert masters, vanish. Carved into the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan, the facade of Al-Khazneh, known as the Treasury, glows in the shifting desert light. Its majestic columns and intricate details seem almost impossible, as if they were not carved by human hands, but emerged from the mountain itself. For centuries, this monumental structure lay hidden, guarded by the sands and the silence of time. This is the face of Petra, the ancient capital of the Nabataeans, a people once powerful, sophisticated, and widespread, and now largely forgotten. Who were the Nabataeans, and how did they master the relentless desert, only to vanish so completely? What we do know is that the Nabataeans were a nomadic Arab people who by the 4th century BCE began to settle and flourish in the arid landscapes of the Levant. From humble caravan stations, they built a trading empire that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to Damascus, from Gaza to the Persian Gulf. At the peak of their influence, their territory formed a crucial artery of commerce, linking east and west. They were merchants of frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, and precious stones. But more than traders, they were engineers of astonishing skill. In a region where water is scarce, the Nabataeans developed an elaborate system of dams, aqueducts, and cisterns. They channeled flash floods into hidden reservoirs, storing enough water to sustain cities carved directly into the rock face. Petra, in particular, was not just a city. It was a civilization oasis, hidden in plain sight, blossoming from the sandstone. And yet, for all their innovation, the Nabataeans remained shrouded in mystery. They left behind no extensive historical records. Their writing, derived from the Aramaic alphabet, survives primarily in brief inscriptions on tombs, monuments, and pottery. They had no great historian, no archive, no surviving literature. Most of what we know comes from outsiders: the Greeks, the Romans, and later, the Byzantines. These sources admired the Nabataeans' wealth and ingenuity, but they could not or would not capture the soul of the people themselves. Why would such a highly developed culture not preserve its own history? Was it lost or never written? Even their religion is nebulous. The Nabataeans worshipped a pantheon of deities, mixing local Arab beliefs with Hellenistic and Mesopotamian influences. Chief among them was Dushara, a god often represented by a black stone or an unshaped block, aniconic, abstract, and enigmatic. They also venerated the goddess Al-Usa, sometimes identified with Aphrodite or Isis. Many of their temples were carved from the living rock, their altars open to the sky. Was this a theology of nature, rooted in the harshness of desert life? Or does it hint at something older, perhaps an inherited tradition from an even more ancient, undocumented culture? Speculation deepens when we consider Petra itself. The city's architectural style is a fusion of many worlds: Egyptian, Assyrian, Hellenistic, Roman, yet somehow uniquely Nabataean. The facades of tombs and temples reflect a people who borrowed and blended, never overwhelmed. Some scholars argue this cultural adaptability was a deliberate strategy to appear familiar to traders and envoys from all corners of the known world, while maintaining a deeper, more hidden identity within. Others suggest Petra was not just a city, but a sacred landscape, aligned with celestial bodies, designed for both ritual and function. Some structures, including Al-Khazneh and the monastery, appear to mark the solstices and equinoxes with precision. Was Petra also an observatory, a calendar carved in stone? And if so, who taught the Nabataeans to read the stars? By the 2nd century CE, the Nabataean kingdom was annexed by Rome, and with surprising silence, their distinct culture began to fade. Roman rule did not violently annihilate them. There was no great war, no mass conquest, but slowly, subtly, the Nabataeans disappeared from the written record. Their language gave way to Greek and Latin. Their religion was absorbed into new faiths. Their cities were reoccupied, renamed, and then abandoned. Did they assimilate willingly, their identity blurring through trade and diplomacy? Or was their silence a result of deeper pressures, economic decline, shifting trade routes, environmental stress? Stranger theories exist. Some suggest the Nabataeans were heirs to a forgotten Bronze Age people, perhaps related to the elusive Midianites or other nomadic tribes mentioned in biblical and regional texts. Others wonder if Petra was built on the site of an even older sacred location, its foundations predating the Nabataeans themselves, with layers of meaning we no longer recognize. And what of the knowledge they carried with them? What skills, ideas, or stories vanished when their temples emptied and their trade caravans ceased? Today, the Nabataeans are remembered primarily by stone, wordless monuments carved with a precision that still defies explanation. Petra remains one of the world's great wonders, yet its creators are almost anonymous. What kind of people leave cities but not histories? Civil engineering feats but no written treatises, faces carved in rock but no names to match them. Perhaps the Nabataeans never truly disappeared. Perhaps their knowledge lives on in unremarked forms, coded in the architecture, in the local legends, in the quiet rhythm of desert water. But until the stones speak, their story remains a question carved in sandstone, waiting. Carthage, an empire's lost records. Along the shores of modern-day Tunisia, where the Mediterranean Sea laps quietly against golden sands, lie the fragments of what was once Carthage, an empire of seafarers, merchants, and warriors. Today, scattered stones and sun-bleached ruins offer only a faint echo of its grandeur. Beneath the layers of earth, in centuries of silence, lies a deeper loss, not just of walls and cities, but of memory itself. Carthage, a city founded by Phoenician settlers in the 9th century BCE, grew into one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Its influence stretched across North Africa, into Spain, Sicily, and beyond. It rivaled Rome in wealth, strategy, and endurance. And yet, while Rome left its legacy in marble and texts, Carthage left behind a different kind of silence. For most of what we know of Carthage comes not from the Carthaginians themselves, but from their enemies. When Rome finally crushed Carthage in 146 BCE, at the end of the Third Punic War, it did so with brutal finality. The city was sacked, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its buildings razed. The Roman historian Appian claimed Carthage burned for 17 days, that its land was sown with salt, likely a myth, but reflecting the psychological scale of the destruction. But amidst this vengeance, something deeper was lost. Almost all of the written history of Carthaginian civilization. What knowledge vanished in those flames? Carthage was not an illiterate kingdom. Its roots were Phoenician, a culture famed for inventing the alphabet and for seafaring trade networks that spanned the ancient Mediterranean. Carthaginian scribes recorded treaties, ledgers, prayers, and laws in Punic, a variant of Phoenician on papyrus, parchment, and stone. The city held libraries, temple archives, and administrative texts. Their philosophers wrote treatises. Their navigators kept records of exploration and trade. Hanno the Navigator, for instance, was said to have sailed far down the coast of Africa, leaving a detailed account, the single surviving fragment of what was likely a much broader tradition. But almost all of it disappeared. Some Roman authors, like Pliny the Elder, hinted at the richness of Carthaginian knowledge. Pliny mentioned that a vast collection of Carthaginian agricultural writings was translated into Latin under the orders of the Roman Senate, including the work of Mago, a Carthaginian agronomist whose 28-volume guide formed the basis of Roman farming techniques. However, Mago's original Punic text, like so many others, is lost, known only through secondary Latin adaptations or vague references. What happened to the rest? One theory is that the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE included a systematic annihilation of its intellectual and religious heritage. Whether out of practical necessity or ideological intent, the archives were not preserved. The temples, which likely held the most sacred texts, were destroyed. Royal records, if they existed, were burned. The language itself, Punic, was gradually suppressed, and within a few centuries it vanished from common use. Others argue that knowledge may have been scattered. Some Carthaginian refugees fled inland or to other Phoenician colonies. Might fragments of Punic history have survived in private hands or distant libraries? Some Punic inscriptions have been found as far away as Sardinia and Sicily. A few bilingual stelae, written in Punic and Greek or Latin, offer tantalizing glimpses into lost rituals and titles, but these are scraps. Speculation deepens when we consider what might have been in those lost scrolls. Did the Carthaginians possess ancient seafaring charts? Perhaps even records of transatlantic navigation, as some fringe researchers suggest? Could their libraries have preserved Phoenician wisdom from Tyre and Sidon, now irrevocably lost? What theological concepts were held in the temples of Tanit and Balhaman? We know they practiced a complex and now controversial religion, but our understanding is filtered almost entirely through Roman and Greek sources. Hostile voices that painted the Carthaginians as cruel and barbaric. Were these accounts exaggerated? Some historians now believe that Roman descriptions of Carthaginian child sacrifice, for instance, were politically motivated, designed to justify conquest by portraying the enemy as morally depraved. Recent archaeological work at the top Hets, Carthaginian burial sites, suggests a more nuanced picture, but without Carthage's own writings, the truth remains elusive. What did the Carthaginians truly believe? How did they see themselves? Not as enemies, but as heirs of the Phoenician legacy, as innovators, as explorers. The destruction of Carthaginian records did more than erase a city. It silenced a voice in history. It is a silence that breeds questions. Why did Rome not preserve more Carthaginian texts, as it did with Greece? Was the destruction a calculated act of cultural annihilation, an attempt to dominate not just the body, but the mind of a people? Or was it an accident of war and time, fueled by flame and forgotten by chance? Some still hope that buried caches might be discovered, sealed urns beneath the ruins of temples, forgotten scrolls in distant sanctuaries. The dry climate of North Africa may have preserved more than we realize. Perhaps future excavations will uncover a library undisturbed, patiently waiting beneath the layers of ash and rubble. Until then, we are left with the ruins, the Roman commentary, and the enduring question: what was Carthage in its own words? The answer may never come, but the silence itself remains one of the most haunting losses in the history of the ancient world. Mesoamerican codices, the burning of knowledge. In the muted light of a stone courtyard, smoke rose in slow spirals into the highland sky. A fire crackled, fed by strange fuel. Not wood, but bark-covered scrolls and long, folded books, painted with vibrant figures, intricate glyphs, and symbols that no Spaniard could understand. In 1562, in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula, the friar Diego de Landa watched as centuries, perhaps millennia, of recorded thought turned to ash. This was not the destruction of buildings or statues. This was the erasure of memory. The codices, the painted books made from the inner bark of fig trees, were the lifeblood of Mesoamerican civilization. The Maya, the Mixtec, the Aztec, and others used them to record astronomy, history, ritual, medicine, genealogy, and prophecy. They folded like accordion fans, filled with colors that are still bright where they survive. And they were read not in lines, but in flows, woven from glyph and image, spirit and number. But only a handful survive. Out of what may have been thousands of codices across Mesoamerica, fewer than 20 exist today, some of them mere fragments. Of these, only 4 are definitively confirmed to be Maya. The rest were burned, either in public acts of destruction or quietly, piece by piece, as priests and conquistadors sought to eradicate the religious and intellectual traditions of the pagan world they were conquering. Why? The Spanish conquest of the Americas was not just a military campaign. It was also a spiritual one. The Catholic Church saw itself as saving souls from false gods. And in the written traditions of the indigenous peoples, it saw dangerous remnants of a sophisticated cosmology that would not die quietly. To many friars, these books were not merely documents. They were living links to the devil. The codices told of deities, of blood sacrifice, of sacred calendars, and of ancestral wisdom that had no place in the Christian worldview of Europe. Friar Landa, one of the most infamous figures in this history, wrote in his own words, "We found a large number of books, and as they contained nothing but superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Yet he would later attempt to recreate the very language he sought to destroy. In his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, he included a partial alphabet of Maya glyphs, attempting to understand what was already lost. But this alphabet was flawed, a misunderstanding of a complex logographic script. And yet, centuries later, it would prove to be a key to deciphering what remained. And what remained was astonishingly little. What knowledge was lost in those flames? The Maya possessed a calendar more accurate than the Julian. Their astronomers tracked Venus and lunar eclipses with remarkable precision. Their historical records reach back centuries, perhaps into mythical epochs. Their medicine involved herbs and techniques unknown in Europe at the time, and their rituals, woven into the seasonal cycles, the architecture, and the genealogies, formed a worldview both intricate and deeply human. Could the codices have contained philosophies now erased? Maps of sacred sites that were never rediscovered, records of natural phenomena, eclipses, droughts, epidemics, that could rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian history? Some suggest the codices contained even more than science and myth, that they recorded migrations, encoded lost cities, or preserved oral traditions of civilizations even older than the Maya. Others wonder if some codices might still be hidden, kept secretly by indigenous families for generations, buried with priests, or locked away in European library archives under miscatalogued entries. Indeed, a few codices did survive, but barely. The Dresden Codex, now in Germany, narrowly escaped destruction. Its vibrant astronomical charts and ritual tables were once used to predict eclipses and agricultural cycles. The Madrid Codex, rediscovered in the 19th century, lay unnoticed in a Spanish museum. The Paris Codex sat forgotten in the Bibliothèque Nationale for centuries. Each is a window into a lost world, but each is only one chapter in a library that once numbered in the thousands. Even the Aztecs, whose codices were produced later and often in collaboration with Spanish scribes, saw their works disappear. The Codex Mendoza, created for the Spanish crown, was lost at sea and then found. Other documents, like the Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún, survived only because they were filtered through European hands. But what of the originals, those that were not translated or redrawn? What truths were considered too dangerous to preserve? Some modern scholars believe the loss of these texts did more than sever history. It fractured identity. Without written records, many indigenous communities were forced to rely solely on oral tradition, vulnerable to colonial reinterpretation. Cultural memory became fragmented, languages began to disappear, and with them, the frameworks through which entire civilizations understood themselves and the cosmos. Was this destruction a deliberate act of cultural genocide, or a tragic byproduct of spiritual conquest? Did the Spanish truly understand what they were burning? And how many voices remain locked in silence, their stories reduced to ash, their meaning waiting in the symbols carved in stone or buried beneath the forest canopy? The smoke from the burning codices has long since dispersed into the sky, but the loss still hangs in the air, quiet, irreversible, and profoundly unfinished. And somewhere, perhaps in a hidden vault or an untouched cave, the last codex waits to speak again. Nalanda, the loss of a great university. In the heart of Bihar, India, through the morning mist and the faint scent of sandalwood drifting across the plains, lie the silent ruins of what was once the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, Nalanda. Red brick stupas and crumbling monasteries stretch across the land, scattered like the last breaths of a vast and vanished civilization's intellect. Along the stone walkways now trod by birds and wind, the footsteps of scholars, pilgrims, and monks once echoed. Here, knowledge was not merely studied, it was lived, shared, and preserved. And then it was burned. Nalanda University, founded in the 5th century CE, was more than a center of Buddhist philosophy. It was a thriving international university, centuries before Europe's oldest institutions emerged. Students came from China, Tibet, Korea, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Its library was said to hold hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, texts on logic, medicine, astronomy, grammar, metaphysics, mathematics, and Buddhist Dharma in all its forms. According to travelers like Xuanzang and I Ching, Nalanda was a place of the deepest rigor and spiritual depth. Its scholars debated openly, translated texts into multiple languages, and maintained a fragile lineage of ancient thought. But in the 12th century, that legacy turned to ash. The widely accepted account tells of Bakhtiar Khilji, a military commander of the Ghurid dynasty who swept through northern India in the late 1100s. As part of his campaign, he is believed to have attacked Nalanda, seeing it not as a sanctuary of learning, but as a symbol of resistance and power. The libraries were reportedly set ablaze, the monks slaughtered, and the buildings left in ruin. Later sources claim the fires that consumed Nalanda's manuscripts burned for days, some say for months. But as with many such historical events, the truth lies somewhere between the record and the rumor. No contemporary Muslim source specifically mentions the burning of Nalanda by name. Much of the story comes from later chronicles, written decades or even centuries afterwards. Accounts like those of Minhaji Siraj, or Persian writings that conflate multiple universities or events. Archaeological evidence confirms the destruction of structures at Nalanda around this period, but the cause, the scale, and the precise identity of the attacker remain a subject of debate. Was Khilji acting out of religious zeal? Was the destruction strategic, aimed at a stronghold of cultural influence during a military expansion? Or was it a tragic consequence of broader social upheaval where Nalanda simply lay in the path of a changing empire? And what exactly was lost in the fire? That question may never be fully answered. Nalanda's library is said to have comprised three main buildings: the Ratnasagara, the Ratnodadi, and the Ratnaranyaka, names meaning Ocean of Jewels, Sea of Jewels, and Jewel Grove. In these towers, thousands of manuscripts on palm leaves and birch bark were cataloged and guarded. These were not just sacred Buddhist texts, but treatises on medicine, chemistry, engineering, architecture, linguistics, and metaphysics, many of which may not have existed anywhere else. What if these texts contained scientific theories centuries ahead of their time? What if commentaries on lost philosophical teachings, Vedic, Jain, or Buddhist, lay within those volumes now gone? And more hauntingly, how much of India's ancient intellectual heritage was erased by this single act? Some suggest that copies of key manuscripts survived, carried away and preserved in Tibet and China. Indeed, Chinese scholars like Xuanzang had already translated many works during their pilgrimages to Nalanda, but these were snippets, not the full archive. Others believe some manuscripts may still lie buried in the surrounding regions, waiting discovery, sealed in subterranean chambers, or hidden in monasteries that escaped the flames. There are also those who question whether Nalanda truly died that day. Historical records hint that Nalanda may have continued to function in a limited form for decades after the attack. Some Buddhist institutions adapted, relocated, or merged with others. Nevertheless, the aura of Nalanda, the perception of it as the pinnacle of an intellectual golden age, was undeniably shattered. It would never again draw students by the thousands. The fire did not just destroy books, it severed a thread of cultural continuity. There is a peculiar silence to this loss. No detailed list of the destroyed library exists. No roster of names, no catalog. The thoughts, voices, and visions of centuries were not just lost. They were unrecorded. Was this a deliberate forgetting? Did the invaders seek to erase not just the texts, but the very idea of the world from which they came? A cosmos built not on conquest but on contemplation? Or is the tragedy of Nalanda more universal? A reminder of how fragile knowledge is, how easily the accumulated wisdom of generations can vanish in a single spark. Today, as the wind moves over the ruins of Nalanda, it carries a stillness, sacred and mournful. The remnants of its stone walls bear no inscription of what once filled its libraries. The echoes of its halls, once alive with debate and learning, now hold only the singing of birds and the breath of the air. And yet beneath the earth, in undiscovered caches or distant monasteries, could fragments still remain? Could the knowledge of Nalanda, burned but not extinguished, still find a way to speak? Perhaps some stories, though silenced, are not yet finished being told. Medieval women, erasure from history. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Europe's medieval monasteries, behind the worn bindings of illuminated manuscripts, and beneath the layers of dust on the crumbling stones of cathedrals, there are traces, faint, fragmented, of lives once lived and voices long silenced. Some appear in the margins, scribbled in Latin. Others are woven into the folds of faded textiles or carved into forgotten tombs. But look closely, and a pattern begins to emerge. Names missing, deeds unrecorded, stories untold. This is not simply a case of lost history. This is a history of deliberate silencing, of a quiet erasure of women from the medieval record. What was taken and why? The medieval world was not, despite modern perceptions, a monolith of male dominance. Women were scribes, physicians, landowners, abbesses, philosophers, queens, poets, mystics. They commanded armies, wrote texts, taught theology. In the early Middle Ages, before rigid institutional structures solidified, Many women moved with surprising agency through the spiritual and intellectual currents of their time, but much of their legacy vanished. Consider, for instance, the case of the women scribes. In several monasteries, particularly in the Germanic world, archaeological evidence has revealed that women not only copied sacred texts, but illuminated them. Recent research found microscopic traces of lapis lazuli, a rare and expensive blue pigment, in the dental plaque of a woman buried in an 11th century German convent. She has no surviving name, but the presence of the pigment indicates she was an artist, licking the tip of her brush to bring her work to perfection. Her presence was never recorded in the manuscript she helped create. How many such women labored in silence, anonymous even in the margins? Or consider Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century mystic, writer, composer, and visionary. Her theological works and compositions were so prolific, so groundbreaking, that she was canonized centuries later. But even Hildegard's name was nearly lost. Her works were attributed to men, dismissed as mystical hyperbole, or confined to monastic study for centuries. Were her stories the exceptions that survived, or merely the tip of a vast and hidden tradition? In the royal courts, too, women played crucial roles as advisors, diplomats, and strategists. Empress Theophanu, the Byzantine wife of Otto II, effectively ruled the Holy Roman Empire during her son's minority. Her influence on art, politics, and religious policy shaped an entire generation. And yet, she is rarely mentioned outside of specialized texts. And what of the queens who ruled, the regents who made peace, the noblewomen who managed estates and commanded troops in their husband's absence? Why were they so often reduced in the chronicles to wives, daughters, consorts, never acknowledged as agents in their own right? Part of the answer lies in the keepers of historical memory. For centuries, history was primarily recorded by men, monks, court scribes, clerics, whose perspectives reflected the values and structures of their institutions. What did not fit within those frameworks was often ignored, minimized, or reattributed. Women's accomplishments were sometimes credited to their male relatives or spiritual advisors. Their names might be altered, Latinized, or omitted entirely in the process of translation and copying. And then there is the question of destruction. As religious and political shifts swept across Europe, the Reformation, Revolution, centralization, archives were purged, monasteries were dissolved, libraries burned. Manuscripts focusing on female saints, women mystics, or even female genealogies were more likely to be dismissed as irrelevant, heretical, or outdated. Some were deliberately destroyed. Others were simply abandoned until they crumbled into dust. How many books written by women moldered away in monastic cells? How many songs, prayers, scientific treatises, and letters were lost because they bore the name of the wrong author? More speculative theories suggest even deeper silences. Some researchers propose that entire traditions of female healing and spiritual practices were absorbed into folklore and dismissed as superstition. The image of the wise woman, the herbalist, the midwife, once respected in her village, was gradually demonized. By the time of the witch trials centuries later, the accumulated knowledge of countless generations of women had been reframed as dangerous, heretical, or evil. Could this represent not just a loss of individuals, but a systematic dismantling of parallel knowledge systems, rooted in lived experience, in the rhythms of the body and the earth? There are even scholars who argue that some surviving texts, now attributed to men, may have originally been written by women. The medieval practice of palimpsest, of reusing parchment by scraping away old text, often allowed scribes to erase or replace names. Could some of our canonical works conceal unfamiliar hands beneath the familiar signatures? And then there are the physical silences, the unnamed graves, the defaced statues, the entries in monastic archives with blotted out records. Not all erasure happens with ink. Nevertheless, hope remains. In recent decades, new techniques, paleography, digital restoration, isotopic analysis, have begun to shed light on the missing half of the story. Fragments are being pieced together. Anonymous hands are being matched to specific schools or workshops. Some of the erased names are finding their way back into being, but much remains hidden. Why were so many women excluded from the record, even when they left behind works, deeds, and names? Was it a slow erosion of memory or a deliberate rewriting of the past? And how many voices are still waiting in the margins, in the palimpsests, in the footnotes, in the dusty vaults, to be heard again? The medieval world was not without its women's minds, hands, or words, but the silence that follows them, that silence still speaks volumes. The House of Wisdom, a lost intellectual hub. In the hushed corners of ancient Baghdad, where the Tigris once shimmered with the light of scholars burning oil late into the night, there stood a library unlike any the world had ever known. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was more than a repository of scrolls. It was a melting pot of intellect, a sanctuary of translation, debate, and discovery. Within its walls, languages mingled: Greek, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, all converging in quiet harmony. Astronomers calculated the movements of distant stars. Mathematicians unraveled the secrets of algebra. Philosophers walked in the shadow of Aristotle and Plotinus, reimagined through the lens of a new world. And then it disappeared. The destruction of the House of Wisdom remains one of history's most enduring cultural tragedies. It is often dated to 1258 CE, when Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan laid siege to Baghdad, then the flourishing heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. For 7 days, the city was ravaged. Palaces looted, mosques burned, and the library with its countless volumes was cast into the river. According to accounts that have survived, the Tigris ran black with ink for days. But how much of this is historical record, and how much is legend? The House of Wisdom was established in the 9th century under the caliphs Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun. Modeled partly on earlier Persian and Hellenistic institutions, it rapidly grew into a center of scholarship, attracting thinkers from across the known world. It was here that the works of Plato and Galen were translated into Arabic, often alongside original commentaries that pushed knowledge far beyond its classical origins. Here, scholars refined trigonometry, developed algorithms, mapped celestial bodies, debated metaphysics, and recorded the intricate geometry of the heavens. It was not a library in the modern sense. It was a living organism, a school, a workshop, a gathering of minds. And its destruction was not simply the loss of paper and ink. It was the silencing of centuries of voices. Nevertheless, the specific details of that destruction remain elusive. Did the Mongols truly destroy the House of Wisdom? Some historians now question whether the library, as described by medieval chroniclers, even existed in that form by the time of Hulagu's siege. Baghdad had been suffering from political and intellectual decline for decades before the invasion. Perhaps the House of Wisdom was already weakened, its scholars dispersed, its collections fragmented or moved. Others suggest the river running black with ink may be poetic hyperbole, an image meant to symbolize cultural devastation rather than a literal fact. The main source for this story, the Syriac Christian chronicler Bar Hebraeus, was writing years after the event. No eyewitness from Baghdad described the drowning of books in such terms, and yet the legend persists. Why? Perhaps because it captures something deeper than historical accuracy. Whether or not the books were literally dumped into the river, there is no doubt that the Mongol conquest shattered the intellectual infrastructure of the Abbasid world. Thousands died. The caliph was executed. The city's leading scholars were dispersed or killed. The institutional memory of the House of Wisdom, its networks, its patrons, its physical manuscripts, vanished almost overnight. What knowledge perished in that silence? We may never know. The records of the House of Wisdom were vast and varied. Among its treasures were translations of Greek natural philosophy, treatises on Indian mathematics, original texts on optics and chemistry, anatomical diagrams, star charts, medical encyclopedias, and rare ancient histories now lost to time. Some scholars believe it was here that the scientific method was first truly applied. Others suggest that key innovations in engineering and navigation may have emerged from within its walls. Might the library have held books from even older civilizations? Works from Alexandria, from Persia, from Babylon itself? And were copies made, perhaps hidden away in distant cities like Nishapur, Damascus, or Cordoba? Might fragments still survive in private collections or buried archives unrecognized or unread? Speculative theories extend further. Some suggest the Mongol destruction was not merely an accident of war, but a strategic cultural decapitation, an attempt to neutralize Baghdad not just as a political power, but as an intellectual beacon. Others see the loss of the House of Wisdom as a warning that knowledge, however vast, is fragile when anchored to a place and a power. And yet, despite the destruction, echoes remain. The Arabic translations made at the House of Wisdom spread far beyond Baghdad, forming the basis for later Islamic scholarship and eventually for the European Renaissance. The works of Avicenna, Al-Hasan, Al-Khwarizmi, names shaped by the house, lived on in Latin manuscripts as studied by scholars from Bologna to Oxford. But these were only the visible survivors. What of the rest? The vanished texts, the unnamed thinkers, the ideas that were never passed on. What understanding of the natural world, of history, of mathematics, or of metaphysics may have been lost forever? Today, as we walk through the ruins of old Baghdad or trace our fingers over faded Arabic manuscripts, we feel not just the passage of time, but the weight of absence. An absence measured not by what we know, but by what we can no longer even ask. The House of Wisdom was not just destroyed, it was forgotten. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. What might we remember if the river had not run black? And what else might be waiting in the silence to be found again? The Lushan Rebellion, a golden age ends. As the morning mist drifts through the mountain passes of central China, obscuring the ruins of old fortifications and long-forgotten roads, it is easy to forget that this landscape was once the heart of a world-shattering upheaval. A rebellion so vast, so sudden, and so destructive that it nearly brought down one of the greatest empires in human history. This was the Lushan Rebellion, a conflict that began with a single ambitious general and ended with a death toll so staggering it still defies comprehension. But what truly happened in those dark years? And why does the full story remain so elusive? The Tang dynasty in the 8th century CE was at the height of its power. Its capital, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth, a glittering center of art, science, trade, and culture. Foreign merchants filled its markets. Buddhist temples, Taoist sanctuaries, and Confucian schools coexisted in uneasy harmony. The Silk Road pulsed with goods and ideas flowing into and out of China. Under the Emperor Xuanzong, the dynasty seemed invincible, but beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. The military system had shifted from a citizen-soldier model to one reliant on regional commanders, the Jiedushi, who controlled vast territories with increasing autonomy. These generals commanded private armies, collected their own taxes, and wielded immense power, often eclipsing that of the central government. Among them was Lushan, a general of Sogdian and Turkic descent, charismatic, cunning, and deeply embedded at court through his relationship with the emperor and his beloved concubine, Yang Guifei. In 755 CE, Lushan launched a rebellion, marching his troops from the northeast. He captured the capital with shocking speed. What followed was nearly a decade of chaos, a civil war that shattered the illusion of Tang supremacy, depopulated entire regions, and left cities burned, temples sacked, and millions dead. Some modern estimates place the death toll at over 30 to 40 million, one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. But how did it all happen so quickly? Historians point to systemic weaknesses, corruption, imperial indulgence, and an over-reliance on frontier generals. The court had become detached, bloated with intrigue. The emperor himself, once wise and diligent, had become increasingly aloof. However, others see something deeper, a kind of civilizational breaking point, where the very weight of the empire's complexity turned against itself. Why did so many soldiers follow Lushan? Was it simple loyalty, ethnic solidarity, or were there deeper fissures within Tang society that made the rebellion not just possible, but inevitable? The rebellion itself was not a single clear-cut war. It fractured into layers, rival warlords, opportunistic uprisings, shifting alliances. And Lushan declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Yan, but was killed by his own son within 2 years. The the rebellion did not end with his death. In fact, it spread, becoming a brutal, slow-burning collapse that devastated the empire from within. The human cost was catastrophic. Cities emptied, irrigation systems fell into disrepair, famine and plague followed battle. The Tang court, eventually restored in a weakened form, never fully recovered. The dynasty would limp on for another century, but the golden age was over. And yet, for its scale, the Lushan rebellion remains surprisingly underappreciated in the global historical consciousness. Why? Some believe it is due to the way Chinese historiography views collapse as cyclical rather than a single catastrophe. Others point to the political sensitivities of discussing ethnic tensions or to the romanticized narrative built around Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei, a story of tragic love that overshadows the deeper systemic failures. But some questions go further. Did the rebellion mark the beginning of a much longer transformation, where the imperial center of China shifted forever, in spirit as well as in substance? Did it sow the seeds for the later fragmentation of the empire, the rise of regional powers, and the long-term weakening of a centralized Confucian order? More speculative theories suggest the rebellion may have disrupted more than just politics. Some point to abrupt breaks in astronomical records, in mathematical treatises, and in poetic collections. Cultural silences that hint at knowledge lost or deliberately buried? Could it be that archives were destroyed, that scrolls, maps, or instruments vanished during sieges, that something more than administration and art was lost? And what of Lushan himself? Was he a traitor, a rebel, a usurper? Or was he, as some sources suggest, manipulated by court factions who saw him as a tool until he turned on them? His mixed ethnicity, once a symbol of Tang cosmopolitanism, was later scapegoated to explain his ambition. But was his rise a symptom rather than a cause of deeper decay? Today, little remains of the physical legacy of the Lushan rebellion. Cities have been rebuilt, battlefields forgotten. Chronicles survive, but they are incomplete, colored by politics, and often retold through the lens of later dynasties yearning for order rather than ambiguity. But the questions remain: how could a single rebellion bring a golden age to its knees? What truths were lost amidst the ashes of Chang'an and the ruined villages of the north? And how many more such stories are hidden in the quiet corners of history where glory ends and shadow begins? The empire survived, but something vital did not. And in that silence, the true cost of the rebellion may still be waiting to be heard. The Maccabean Wars, Revolution in Memory. Beneath the ochre stones of the Judean hill country, where olive groves sway in a sun that has seen empires rise and fall, echoes linger of a forgotten revolution. Small mountain paths wind between ancient ruins, where wild herbs grow in the cracks of weathered stones. It was in these rugged landscapes, not quite desert, not quite settled, that a rebellion was born. A movement not just of swords and soldiers, but of faith, identity, and defiance. This was the time of the Maccabean Wars. But how much do we truly understand what happened in those turbulent years, and how much is shaped by myth, memory, and silence? In the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire stretched from Asia Minor to the borders of India, a Hellenistic dynasty founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Seleucids ruled over a mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions. Among them was the Jewish population of Judea, a people who had long balanced local autonomy with foreign oversight. That balance was shattered under the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Accounts describe a period of enforced Hellenization. Jewish religious practices were suppressed, circumcision outlawed, and the temple in Jerusalem desecrated, dedicated to Zeus, its altars used for pagan sacrifice. This was not just political subjugation. It was seen as an assault on the sacred, a threat not just to a people's land, but to their very covenant with God. And then something unexpected happened. A priest named Nabataeans from the small town of Modian refused to offer sacrifice to the king's gods. According to tradition, he killed the king's emissary and fled into the wilderness with his 5 sons. There, among the caves and valleys, they gathered followers, peasants, zealots, priests. After Nabataeans' death, his son Judah, nicknamed Maccabee, the Hammer, led a guerrilla rebellion that ignited a fire across the country. The Maccabean revolt, beginning around 167 BCE, was improbable from the start. A small band of rebels, poorly armed and vastly outnumbered, taking on one of the most powerful armies of the ancient world. And yet they prevailed. Using hit-and-run tactics, night raids, and a masterful use of the terrain, the Maccabees pushed back against the Seleucid forces. Within 3 years, they had retaken Jerusalem. In 164 BCE, they purified the temple, removed the foreign idols, and relit the eternal flame. This act is celebrated in the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, but the story that follows what happened after the rededication is told less often. The conflict did not end with one victory. The Maccabean Wars continued for decades, as the Hasmoneans, as the ruling family came to be known, fought against both Seleucid forces and internal rivals. Judea oscillated between autonomy and dependency, between priestly leadership and royal ambition. The line between freedom fighters and monarchs blurred. What began as a revolt for religious purity became a complex dynastic struggle. Foreign alliances were made, civil wars erupted, and treaties were signed with the rising power of Rome. Within a generation, the Maccabees transformed from rebels to rulers. Was this the natural course of revolution or something else? Some scholars suggest the later Hasmoneans, though claiming to uphold the traditions of their ancestors, gradually adopted the very Hellenistic customs they had once fought against. Coins bearing their images mimicked Greek designs. Political marriages crossed religious lines. Ritual authority became intertwined with secular ambition. Did the Maccabees win, only to become what they had once opposed? And what of the historical record itself? Our main sources for the Maccabean Wars come from texts like 1 and 2 Maccabees, books preserved in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, but not in the later Hebrew Bible. These texts are detailed and profoundly shaped by a theological vision. They present the Maccabees as chosen instruments of divine justice. Miracles are described, battles are recounted in vivid, triumphant terms, but what lies beneath the religious narrative? Other texts, like those of Josephus, writing centuries later, offer additional perspectives, but also introduce further questions. His accounts mix Roman influence, Jewish loyalties, and personal interpretation. And in the gaps between these sources, mystery lingers. Why do we have so few independent records from the Seleucid side? Were documents lost or were they never written? And deeper still, what cultural or philosophical ideas might have been suppressed during this time? What rival interpretations of the rebellion were silenced as the Hasmoneans consolidated power? Were there other sects, voices, or visions of resistance that simply vanished into the dust? Archaeology offers a few tantalizing clues. Hidden fortresses have been uncovered in the Judean hills, hastily built stone walls, buried caches of supplies, signal fires long extinguished. Pottery shards and ritual objects speak of a people caught between war and worship. Inscriptions from later Hasmonean kings, once defaced or removed, are now being re-examined. Nevertheless, much remains unknown. Were the Maccabean Wars a sudden explosion, or the culmination of years of building tension between tradition and assimilation? Did they mark a turning point in Jewish history, or a cyclical conflict repeated again and again through time? And why does the surviving narrative feel so complete, yet so strangely unfinished? The Maccabees became symbols of resistance, but history, as always, is more complex than the symbol, and somewhere between the blood-soaked stones of the temple and the weathered rocks of Judea, the full truth may still be waiting, quietly buried beneath the story we have been told. The German Peasants' War, a forgotten uprising. In the misty valleys of the German countryside, where rivers wind through low hills and the air carries the scent of damp earth, the remnants of destroyed villages and burned abbeys can still be found. Quiet scars of a forgotten rebellion. Fields that are now peaceful were once trampled by tens of thousands of desperate feet. Beneath the cobblestone streets of medieval market towns echo the strains of hymns sung in defiance, of slogans scrawled on parchment, of peasants grasping scythes not for harvest, but to fight for justice. This was the German Peasants' War, an uprising that swept across the Holy Roman Empire in a storm of hope, fury, and ultimately, silence. But what truly caused this rebellion, and why did its deeper meaning fade into the margins of European memory? Between 1524 and 1525, a movement emerged, unexpected in its scale, astonishing in its ambition. It began with local grievances, tithes too high, hunting rights taken, lands seized by nobles and abbots. For centuries, peasants had borne the burden of serfdom, the crushing obligations of feudal law, and the unpredictable brutality of lords, both secular and spiritual. But now something had changed. The winds of the Reformation were blowing. Martin Luther's theses had shattered the religious order of Europe just a few years before. While Luther himself would eventually recoil from the rebellion, his writings had already shaken the foundations of authority. The Bible, he argued, should be read by all. Salvation came not through hierarchy, but through faith. To a peasant, this was not just a theological subtlety. It was liberation. Why should a priest own land while a farmer starved? Why should a noble hunt in forests where a laborer could not gather wood? If all men were equal before God, what gave one man the right to rule another? Ideas spread in pamphlets and sermons. Alliances formed in taverns and churches. A document emerged known as the 12 Articles. Clear, concise, and revolutionary. It demanded an end to serfdom, fair treatment from lords, and the right of communities to choose their own pastors. It was not wild or anarchic. It was a call for justice, based, the authors claimed, on scripture. And yet the response was swift and brutal. At its height, the rebellion involved over 300,000 peasants across southern and central Germany. They seized castles, stormed monasteries, and formed armed bands under charismatic leaders like Thomas Müntzer, a former priest who preached a fiery gospel of divine judgment on the wicked. Müntzer called for the violent overthrow of the godless, urging the peasants to take up the sword as an instrument of divine will. But the rebellion was fractured. Some groups fought under the banner of Christian reform. Others simply demanded food. Some formed councils, others looted. The nobility, initially stunned, quickly regrouped. Armed with better equipment, better training, and the support of both princes and clergy, they crushed the rebellion with horrifying force. By the end of 1525, over 100,000 peasants were dead. Villages were wiped clean. Rebels were tortured, executed, or forced into even greater destitution. The reformers distanced themselves. Luther, appalled by the radicalism of the revolt, denounced the peasants in harsh, unforgiving terms, and what had begun as a cry for justice became a cautionary tale. Order was restored, or so it seemed, but deeper questions remain. Was the Peasants' War merely a failed social uprising, or the first tremor of something larger? Some historians see in it the early seeds of modern revolution. Others argue it was too fragmented, too theological to fit that definition. Still others suggest the real threat it posed was not military, but symbolic. A world where ordinary people, for a brief moment, believed they could reshape society. Even more puzzling is how quickly the memory of the war was buried. Unlike the French or Russian revolutions, the German Peasants' War left few monuments. Its leaders, like Müntzer, were executed or discredited. Its documents, like the 12 Articles, were condemned and suppressed. Even centuries later, attempts to revive its memory by socialists, nationalists, and romantic poets were fleeting, fragmented, and often reinterpreted for new purposes. Why was such a massive rebellion so thoroughly forgotten? Some point to the deeply hierarchical nature of post-war society, others to the religious divisions that followed, which refocused attention on conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. Others suggest the war's meaning was too ambiguous, too inconvenient to serve as an inspiration. Was it a peasant revolution or a theological uprising? A call for equality or an eruption of chaos? And what if it was both? Archaeological traces have been found. Hidden weapons, burned chapels, documents buried in cathedral archives, but many stories remain untold. Letters between rebel leaders hint at strategies and alliances we still don't fully understand. In rural folklore, songs and tales have persisted that may date back to the rebellion, masked, distorted, but surviving. And perhaps most intriguingly, some scholars suggest that more radical ideas were debated than ever appeared in print. Ideas about collective ownership, about the redistribution of land, about churches led by commoners rather than clergy? Ideas that in other centuries would reappear under very different banners? What conversations were held around the campfires in the forests of Swabia? What hopes were whispered among those who held scythes instead of swords? The German Peasants' War was not just a failure, it was an eruption of memory, of identity, and of justice. A brief moment when the powerless rose up and said aloud what had long been forbidden. And while their rebellion was crushed, the questions they asked still echo, unanswered, waiting, hidden beneath the soil of history. The Haitian Revolution, a world-changing event. The winds that blow across the hills of northern Haiti carry more than the scent of sugarcane and salt. They whisper through the ruins of plantation manors, through crumbling stone walls overgrown with vines, through the choked foundations of what were once palaces and garrisons. In the dim moonlight, the silent remains of the Palace of Sans-Souci shimmer with a quiet grandeur. Now the skeleton of an empire, the memory of a revolution unlike any other in recorded history. The Haitian Revolution was not just a war for independence. It was a world-changing upheaval, a mystery, a warning, a promise. But why is it still so often omitted from the grand narratives of global history? In the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was the most profitable in the world. Plantations fueled by brutal slave labor produced sugar, coffee, indigo, wealth that flowed to Paris, enriching an elite and bolstering the very revolutionaries who would soon demand liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet on that same island, over 500,000 enslaved Africans lived under a system of violence, a cruelty so deliberate, so ingrained, that even contemporary European observers recoiled. Branding, mutilation, death by torture, these were not exceptions, but the regular tools of control. The colony's wealth came at the price of unimaginable human suffering. And then in 1791, something extraordinary happened. On the northern plains of the colony, a massive slave rebellion erupted. Organized, swift, and devastatingly effective. Plantations burned. Armies of the enslaved began to march under unfamiliar banners. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Colonial authorities were stunned. What caused the uprising? Historians point to a confluence of causes: the influence of the French Revolution, the spread of abolitionist ideas, the demand of the free black elite for civil rights. But perhaps something deeper, more elusive, was at work. In the shadowy groves of Bois Caïman, legend tells of a Vodou ceremony where slave leaders gathered, invoked the spirits of their ancestors, and swore an oath in blood and unity. The historical veracity of the ceremony is debated, but its symbolic power is undiminished. Could spiritual traditions, carried across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans, have played a role not just in sustaining resistance, but in coordinating it? The rebellion quickly escalated into a war, complex, multi-layered, and filled with strange alliances. French, Spanish, and British forces intervened, each seeking to seize the colony or suppress the revolt. And yet, despite overwhelming odds, the rebel armies, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe, outmaneuvered their opponents time and again. Louverture, once a slave, rose to become governor of the colony under nominal French rule. He negotiated, legislated, and defended Saint-Domingue with military genius. But in 1802, Napoleon sent a massive expedition to regain control and likely re-establish slavery. The response was unwavering. The revolution deepened, hardened. The French forces were decimated not just by Haitian tactics, but by disease, by the terrain, and by the sheer resilience of the fighters. Louverture was captured and died in a French prison, but the revolution did not die with him. In 1804, Dessalines declared the colony's independence. Haiti emerged, the world's first black republic, and the only nation born from a successful slave rebellion. It was a shock to the global system. So why was this history buried? European and American powers immediately moved to isolate Haiti. France demanded reparations for lost property, including slaves, and Haiti was forced into crippling debt. The United States, as still a slave-holding republic, refused to recognize it. For much of the 19th century, Haiti remained isolated, politically shunned, economically strangled, and perhaps most importantly, historically diminished. Official narratives treated the revolution as an anomaly. Some portrayed it as chaos, others simply ignored it. But to those watching, enslaved or colonized throughout the world, it was something else. Proof that the impossible was possible. And yet questions remain. How did an army of former slaves manage to defeat some of the era's most powerful European empires? Was the uprising truly spontaneous? Or were networks of resistance, both spiritual and political, building for years? Were there external influences, letters, emissaries, unknown figures, that helped guide the revolution from the shadows? And what of the knowledge systems carried to the island from Africa? Oral traditions, political structures, ritual frameworks. How did these shape the resilience of the revolt? There are half-recorded stories of secret councils, of divine dreams, of coordinated uprisings too complex to have emerged overnight. There are patterns in the tactics of battles that hint at a shared memory, not just improvisational resistance. Could the revolution have been the culmination of something older? Something carried across oceans and preserved in whispered prayers and coded songs? Even in Haiti today, traces of the revolution's deeper meanings are hidden in the music, the language, the rituals. The revolution was not merely political, it was spiritual, cultural, cosmological, and perhaps that is why it still disturbs. For it was not merely a rejection of slavery, but a rejection of an entire worldview. The Haitian Revolution overturned the logic of empire. It proved that those who were most brutally oppressed could not only resist, but overthrow the system entirely. And in the silence that followed, the economic blockades, the historical erasure, the whispered fear in distant capitals, the question remains: what else was lost when this history was forgotten? What might we still uncover? Not in the official records, but in the songs, in the scars, in the stones. The Haitian Revolution did not disappear. It lives on in the shadows, in the memory, in a legacy too powerful to be fully erased. And yet, even now, its full story remains, waiting. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, a short war's lingering questions. The air over Stone Town in Zanzibar often hangs thick with the scent of cloves and salt, as the waves of the Indian Ocean lap gently against the crumbling, coral stone buildings of this once gilded port. Narrow alleyways wind past ornate doorways carved with Arabic script, where echoes of the past linger like incense through arches and shuttered balconies. It is here, in this ancient city on the edge of Africa and Arabia, that one of colonial history's strangest episodes unfolded. An event that flashed brightly and vanished almost as quickly as it began. A war that lasted less than an hour, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. But can a conflict be measured in minutes? Or is its brevity part of a deeper mystery yet to be fully revealed? On the morning of August 27, 1896, a British ultimatum expired. Just 38 minutes later, the guns fell silent. It was officially the shortest war in recorded history. And yet behind this curious historical footnote lies a story of imperialism, ambition, resistance, and the shadows that still stretch across the Indian Ocean. Zanzibar in the late 19th century was a place of immense strategic and economic importance. An island sultanate that had once been part of the vast Omani maritime empire. It was a hub of trade and diplomacy where African, Arab, Indian, and European interests collided. Its markets pulsed with ivory, spices, and slaves. While slavery had been abolished in much of the world, Zanzibar's role in the Indian Ocean slave trade persisted much longer, operating through a labyrinth of local and regional networks. By 1890, Britain had secured Zanzibar as a protectorate, part of its larger campaign to control the East African coastline. Under this arrangement, the British wielded immense influence, but allowed the Sultan to rule in name. When Sultan Hamad bin Thawani, a British ally, died suddenly on August 25, 1896, possibly poisoned, his cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, quickly seized the palace and proclaimed himself ruler. The British, unconsulted and unwilling to accept a sultan they did not approve of, saw this move as a challenge. They issued an ultimatum. Khalid must step down by 9 a.m. on August 27th. He refused. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the British warships anchored in the harbor opened fire. The bombardment was precise, devastating. The Sultan's palace, a grand coral stone building facing the sea, was reduced to ruins. Artillery positions were destroyed, and Khalid's small force, estimated at around 2,800 men armed with outdated rifles and a ceremonial cannon, crumbled almost instantly. By 9:40 a.m., the war was over. Khalid fled to the German consulate. Some 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded. On the British side, one sailor was injured. So why does this brief encounter still feel incomplete? Some point to the deeper implications of Khalid's defiance. His refusal, however short-lived, represented a refusal to bow to foreign control, a protest against an empire that was increasingly turning Zanzibar into a pawn in a game of global dominance. While history would record him as a footnote, Khalid's actions raised questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the limits of British influence. And then there is the question of the palace itself. Eyewitnesses described the bombardment as curiously targeted. Some claimed only certain wings of the palace were destroyed, parts rumored to contain archives, private quarters, and collections of royal correspondence. Was the destruction merely aimed at toppling the rebellious sultan? Or was it also meant to erase documents, secrets, or alliances that had become inconvenient? There is no official record of what was lost in the fire. Could there have been letters revealing negotiations with other powers, perhaps Germany or the Ottoman Empire? Were there records of resistance networks or evidence of illicit trade routes still operating beneath British oversight? Speculative theories abound. Some suggest Khalid bin Bargash may have possessed information damaging to British interests, perhaps related to arms trafficking or the illegal slave routes still operating along the Swahili coast. Others offer a simpler explanation. The war was intended not just to remove Khalid, but to send a message to other potential claimants. A message written not in words, but in cannon fire. Curiously, despite the official brevity of the war, British troops continued to patrol and occupy the palace grounds for days after it ended. Ships remained in the harbor. A new sultan, installed by the British, ruled with even less independence than his predecessors. The protectorate tightened its grip. Zanzibar's autonomy faded, and its legacy as a sovereign trading power retreated into memory. But echoes remain. In the decades that followed, the story of Khalid became the subject of rumor and legend. He eventually escaped to German East Africa, living under the protection of the German Empire until captured during World War I. He would never return to power. But the questions surrounding his brief rule and the swift violence that ended it remain surprisingly unanswered. Why was the British response so rapid, so absolute? What was truly at stake in those 38 minutes? And what, if anything, was deliberately buried beneath the ruins of the destroyed Sultan's palace? Today, almost nothing remains of the Sultan's palace. The ocean laps quietly at the seawall. Tourists walk along the waterfront, unaware of the bombardment that once shook this coast. The story is remembered, if at all, as a historical curiosity, a trivia question answer. But perhaps it was more. Perhaps the Anglo-Zanzibar War is not memorable because it was short, but because of how little we understand what truly ended that day, and how much of its meaning might still be hidden beneath the surface, waiting like all lost histories to be asked again. Mesopotamian epics, lost ancient narratives. In the muted corners of museum storerooms and beneath the layers of sand in the ruined cities of Iraq and Syria lie cracked and crumbling clay tablets, scratched remnants of millennia. Their surfaces are etched with wedge-shaped signs, the ancient cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. Some are deciphered, many remain silent, but all whisper fragments of a world once so rich in stories, of gods and heroes, of cosmic battles and sacred laws, that it rivaled and perhaps shaped all that came after it. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the most famous of these ancient narratives. Carved in stone and preserved in fragments within libraries and palaces, it tells the story of a king's search for immortality, but it is often forgotten that Gilgamesh was not alone. The lands between the Tigris and Euphrates were once filled with countless epics, myths, and cosmologies, many of which have vanished. What happened to these lost voices? Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, gave rise to the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. These cultures left behind a staggering quantity of administrative texts, astronomical charts, and religious hymns. Among these were also long poetic works, epics that recounted creation, divine betrayal, mortal valor, and apocalypse. Some were read aloud in temples, others were copied by scribes as exercises in wisdom and piety. But only a fraction of these works survived. Archaeologists have uncovered some 500,000 cuneiform tablets. Of these, only a small number are literary, and of that number, most are fragmentary. Broken edges, missing lines, entire tablets shattered and scattered. Sometimes we find only the end of a story, or a single scene from a once vast mythical cycle. Names appear without context. Gods speak without origin. Battles rage without cause. Could these be the remnants of epics now entirely lost? There are tantalizing hints. In the ruins of Nineveh, in the library of King Ashurbanipal, scribes painstakingly cataloged texts, grouping works by genre, theme, and origin. Among them, mention is made of stories we no longer possess: the deeds of Ninurta, the journey of Enmerkar, the tale of Etana, the lament over Ur. Some are known from other fragments, others we know only by name. What were their plots, their meanings? The Epic of Etana, for instance, survives only in fragments. A king seeks the plant of birth to give his wife a child. He flies on the back of an eagle to the heavens. Then the story breaks off. What happens next? Does he succeed? Was it a story of failed ambition or divine triumph? Even more enigmatic is the Song of Ulikumi, a Hurrian myth preserved in later Hittite versions, possibly derived from the same Mesopotamian oral traditions. It tells of a stone giant who defies the gods. Echoes of this motif appear in other cultures: giants born from the earth, battles in the heavens. Were these stories shared, refashioned, rewritten across different empires? Some scholars believe that Mesopotamia possessed its own mythic cycles, epics not unlike the Homeric poems of Greece or the Mahabharata of India. Great narrative traditions that evolved over centuries of oral and written transmission, now largely gone. Why were they lost? Warfare, fire, abandonment. The cities of Mesopotamia endured centuries of conquest and destruction. Ashurbanipal's library was buried under the ruins of Nineveh when the Medes and Babylonians sacked the city in 612 BCE. Temple libraries in Babylon, Nippur, and Ur were plundered, their tablets scattered or ground into dust. Even when texts physically survived, their meaning was often lost as cuneiform fell out of use. And yet, could more remain, waiting beneath the earth? Many tablets remain unread, locked away in archives or storerooms, their script too damaged, their language too obscure. Recent advances in imaging technology, infrared scanning, 3D modeling, machine transcription, are beginning to shed new light on these ancient documents. A tablet dismissed as legal might conceal a myth beneath its wiped-away lines. A scribe's exercise might preserve a stanza from a forgotten song. Could entire epics still be pieced together from fragments? Could we one day read the Mesopotamian equivalent of Homer's Odyssey, long erased by time? There are also deeper, more speculative questions. Some researchers have wondered if the Mesopotamian myths carried knowledge or codes long forgotten. The gods they described, Enki, Inanna, Marduk, were more than characters. They were cosmological forces, symbols of time, chaos, knowledge, and fertility. Their stories were layered, recursive, often patterned by number. Were these narratives simply entertainment or a way of encoding spiritual truths, astronomical data, or historical memory? In the myth of Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and creates the world from her body. Echoes of this narrative can be found in other cultures: the slaying of chaotic serpents, the shaping of the cosmos from primordial matter. Is this coincidence? Or do these stories point to a shared ancestral mythology, now lost in its earliest form? And what of the scribes themselves? Who chose which stories to copy and which to discard? Did political or religious shifts suppress certain myths? Were some tales considered too sacred or too dangerous to preserve? The clay tablets do not answer. They wait. In the shifting dust of ancient cities, in the sealed boxes of forgotten museums, In the computer models of modern linguists, the lost epics of Mesopotamia still stir, not yet silent, not yet whole, and perhaps not yet truly lost. What truths did they once carry across the ages of memory? What dreams of gods, of humans, of the stars have slipped beyond our reach? And if we listen closely enough, perhaps we can still recover the voice of a forgotten world, buried in clay, waiting to be read again. Early Christianity's diversity and lost paths. In the dry, weathered cliffs of Upper Egypt, near a bend in the Nile, a sealed clay jar lay buried for almost 1,600 years. Inside were leather codices, papyrus books, copied by hand in the Coptic language, filled with unfamiliar gospels, mystical dialogues, and enigmatic sayings attributed to Jesus. Discovered in 1945 near the town of Nag Hammadi, this chance find opened a forgotten door into the earliest centuries of Christianity, a time not of unity, but of divergence, not of a single church, but of many paths, many voices, some remembered, most silenced. Who were these early Christians, and how many of their stories were lost? In popular imagination, early Christianity often appears as a linear progression, a small group of followers, united in belief, gradually spreading their faith throughout the Roman world. But the historical reality is far more complex and enigmatic. In the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, there was no fixed canon, no single authority. Communities across the Mediterranean, the Levant, North Africa, and Mesopotamia interpreted his life and teachings in different ways. Some saw him as a divine being, cloaked in human form, others as a prophet, marked by God. Still others describe visions of a cosmic redeemer descending through layers of reality, battling forces of darkness in a mystical drama far removed from the earthly ministry familiar to modern readers. How did these differences emerge so quickly? And why were so many paths eventually erased? From the Gospel of Thomas, found at Nag Hammadi, we hear a Jesus who teaches not in parables of judgment or law, but in riddles that point inward. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. There is no narrative of crucifixion, no account of resurrection, no emphasis on sin or sacrifice. Instead, the path to salvation lies through self-knowledge. Elsewhere, in the Gospel of Mary, another suppressed text, we find Mary Magdalene not as a repentant sinner, but as a visionary disciple, entrusted with teachings that the male apostles struggle to understand. Peter, in one passage, even questions her authority. Did he really speak to her privately, rather than to us openly? Who preserved these texts, and who decided they were heretical? Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, a fierce battle of interpretations unfolded. While some Christian communities sought unity, others remained decentralized, mystical, apocalyptic. The Gnostics, a catch-all term for various sects, believed the material world was a prison created by an ignorant or even evil lesser god. To them, Jesus was a divine emissary of a higher truth, come to awaken the divine spark within. This view stood in stark contrast to the emerging Orthodox positions. Church leaders like Irenaeus of Lyons worked tirelessly to gather, defend, and impose a more unified vision of Christianity, one centered on the bodily resurrection, the authority of bishops, and the ultimate selection of 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Irenaeus himself admitted that many other texts were in circulation, that entire communities followed other scriptures, other rites. Some read the Gospel of the Egyptians, others the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Still others revered texts that have vanished entirely, lost to time, or perhaps deliberately destroyed. How much theological diversity was lost in the process of creating orthodoxy? The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, often seen as a turning point, was not a spontaneous agreement, but the result of deep and lingering conflicts. The debates that raged there, particularly over the nature of Christ, were echoes of centuries of rival interpretations. And even after the Nicene Creed was established, alternative Christianities persisted on the fringes, in the deserts of Syria, in the valleys of Armenia, in the mountains of Ethiopia. Some of these traditions survived in fragmented form. Others have been reconstructed only from the writings of their opponents, but many remain elusive. What happened to the communities that followed these alternative paths? Were they gradually absorbed by the expanding Orthodox structure, or were they persecuted into complete silence? The destruction of early Christian texts accelerated in the late 4th and 5th centuries, as imperial power was increasingly used to enforce doctrinal uniformity. Libraries were purged, shrines were repurposed. Bishops, once debating rivals, began to wield the power of excommunication and worse. Might there still be lost texts, buried beneath ancient cities or sealed in remote monastic vaults? Some believe the Nag Hammadi find was not unique, but one of many caches hidden by scribes who feared for their spiritual heritage. The Dead Sea Scrolls, though of Jewish origin, proved that entire libraries could remain hidden for millennia. And in the harsh landscapes of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, there may still be places where the voices of early Christianities were not silenced, but simply waiting to be heard again. Even more speculative theories exist. Some researchers suggest that early Christianity was influenced by broader currents. Greek mystery religions, Egyptian cosmologies, Persian dualism. Were some of the lost Christian teachings shaped by initiatory traditions now forgotten? Could the figure of Jesus in some texts have been part of a ritual framework we no longer recognize? And what of the role of women? Many alternative texts elevate female figures, Mary Magdalene, Thecla, Sophia, not as footnotes, but as bearers of revelation. Was this egalitarian vision deliberately suppressed, or simply overwhelmed by the patriarchal systems already embedded in the Roman world? The early Christianities were not heresies. They were possibilities, paths not taken, stories untold. And in the silence left by their disappearance, the questions ring louder. How many gospels were never written down? How many churches vanished without a trace? And how differently might history have unfolded if even one of these lost voices had endured? The clay jars are still buried in the desert. The scrolls are still being pieced together. And somewhere between the lines of what we think we know, early Christianity is still revealing its many forgotten faces. The Minoans, Europe's first vanished civilization, high on the sun-drenched ridge of the island of Crete, where the Aegean Sea stretches in shimmering blue beneath a cloudless sky, the ruins of Knossos lie quietly under the Mediterranean light. Massive staircases descend into rooms without windows. Corridors wind between frescoed walls, scenes of bull leaping, flowing hair, and elegant rituals. Beneath it all, storerooms hold massive clay jars, once filled with oil, wine, or grain. These are the remnants of the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization. And yet, by 1100 BCE, they were gone. How could such an advanced and long-lived civilization disappear? The Minoans had flourished for centuries. From roughly 2000 to 1450 BCE, they dominated the seas of the eastern Mediterranean. Their cities were unfortified, their palaces vast and labyrinthine. They developed one of Europe's earliest writing systems, Linear A, still undeciphered. Their art radiated a love of life, nature, and movement. Unlike the more militaristic iconography of their contemporaries in Egypt or Mesopotamia, trade brought them copper, tin, ivory, and gold. Influence spread from Crete to the Cycladic Islands, to Anatolia, and even as far as the shores of Egypt. And then, quite suddenly, their power collapsed. Archaeologists long assumed a single catastrophic event was to blame. Most often, the volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern Santorini. The eruption, likely occurring around 1600 BCE, was one of the largest in human history. Ash rained down across the Aegean. Tsunamis may have struck the shores of Crete. Some speculated it formed the basis for Plato's later story of Atlantis, a high civilization buried by fire and sea. But the chronology doesn't quite align. Minoan culture persisted for at least another century after the eruption. Their palaces were rebuilt. Their ships still sailed. The bull leaping continued. So if not the volcano, then what? Around 1450 BCE, something shifted. The great palaces, Knossos, Malia, Phaistos, and others, were destroyed in a wave of fires, caused not by nature, but by human hands. And in their wake, a new script began to appear on Crete, Linear B. Unlike Linear A, Linear B has been deciphered. It is an early form of Greek. Its presence signals more than cultural exchange. It suggests conquest. Was Crete invaded by the Mycenaeans, the warlike kings of mainland Greece? Archaeological evidence supports this theory. Mycenaean weaponry, burial customs, and pottery begin to dominate the material culture of Crete. After 1450 BCE, the Minoan language disappears. Administrative records now feature Greek names, and the art, once fluid and organic, becomes rigid, militaristic, and restrained. But curiously, Knossos appears to have survived longer than the other palaces. Some believe it was used as an administrative center by the Mycenaeans until the 14th century BCE. Was it spared in the initial destruction? Did it fall through negotiation rather than fire? Others wonder if the Mycenaean takeover was not a sudden conquest at all, but a gradual process where economic dominance bled into political control. Could elite Minoan families have intermarried with rising Mycenaean powers, trading independence for prestige or survival? And yet, so many mysteries remain. Why were the palaces destroyed with such precision? Why were some buildings leveled, while others were left untouched? Why do we find so few human remains among the ruins? Did the Minoans flee? Were they absorbed? Or were they quietly eliminated, erased not just by fire but by silence? There are hints that internal instability may have played a role. Religious upheaval, economic collapse, or rebellion from within. The palaces functioned not just as royal residences, but as religious and bureaucratic centers. If faith in the ruling priest-kings faltered, could the society have unraveled from within? And then there are the speculative theories. Some point to the still undeciphered script of Linear A as a potential key. If we could read what the Minoans wrote about themselves, their laws, their gods, their fears, we might understand what truly happened. Others suggest the records were there, but they were deliberately destroyed, along with the temples, the symbols, and the names. Did the Mycenaeans suppress Minoan culture, or did they inherit it and transform it beyond recognition? And what of Minoan religion, centered around the enigmatic snake goddess in sacred caves? What became of their rituals, their festivals, their worldview? Some traces appear in later Greek mythology, the labyrinth, the minotaur, the mother goddess. But these are distorted echoes, transformed by time, filtered through the lens of the conquerors. Could more direct evidence still lie hidden beneath the layers of ash and earth? Crete remains only partially excavated. Earthquakes, political instability, and environmental concerns have slowed exploration. Entire complexes may still lie buried. Sealed chambers, libraries, untouched storerooms. And what of recent underwater research? It suggests the Thera eruption was even larger than previously thought, capable of impacting climate patterns for decades. Could long-term environmental shift, crop failure, famine, displacement, have weakened the Minoans from within, paving the way for outside takeover? Or was it something else entirely? A sequence of slow destructions mistaken for one. Today, the frescoes of Knossos still glow with vibrant reds and ochres. They depict dancers, dolphins, sacred bulls, but the meaning of the images is lost. The language in which they were named is unreadable. The songs, the prayers, the last words of a civilization that once ruled the seas are missing. What did the last Minoans think as the flames rose? Did they know this was the end of something great? Or did they believe, as many do, that there would be another tomorrow? The palaces fell, the sea remained, and somewhere, perhaps still buried beneath the rocky soil of Crete or the ash of Thera, the answers wait, quiet and forgotten, beneath the fading brilliance of a vanished world. Great Zimbabwe, monumental stones in silent history. In the highlands of southeastern Zimbabwe, beneath acacia trees and an open sky, massive stone walls rise from the earth, without mortar, without inscription, but with a precision and permanence that defies time. These are the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a site both monumental and enigmatic. Granite boulders are stacked with such mastery that even today, the outer walls of the great enclosure, some over 30 feet high and nearly 1,000 feet in circumference, remain almost perfectly intact. Within are narrow stone passages, towering cones and concentric circles whose original purpose remains unclear. There is no roof, no throne, no written record, just the stones and their silence. Who built this city, and why was it abandoned? Between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, Great Zimbabwe was the heart of a powerful African kingdom that traded in gold, ivory, and cattle over a vast region. Archaeological evidence suggests the city may have been home to as many as 20,000 people at its peak. Chinese porcelain, Arabian glass, and Persian bowls have been found here, hinting at wide-reaching trade routes. The city was not isolated, it was connected, and it was wealthy. However, curiously, for centuries, Great Zimbabwe was almost entirely absent from global historical narratives. When European explorers first encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe that indigenous African peoples could have built such sophisticated structures. Instead, they proposed theories ranging from the ancient Phoenicians to the lost tribes of Israel. Some suggested the Queen of Sheba had once ruled from this site. Others imagined a lost colony of Egyptians or Arabs, projecting their own myths onto stones they could not or would not understand. But there was no evidence of foreign origin. The architecture, the materials, and the layout all pointed to local African craftsmanship. The builders were likely the ancestors of the Shona people, whose oral traditions remember Great Zimbabwe as a royal and sacred place. Iron tools, local stoneworking techniques, and cultural continuities all support an indigenous origin. So why did early narratives resist this conclusion? And what else about Great Zimbabwe has been misunderstood or hidden? The word Zimbabwe itself derives from a Shona phrase, Zimba Zimbabwe, meaning houses of stone. But this was no ordinary city. It was a ceremonial and political center, a symbol of power and cosmology. At the heart stood the conical tower, a massive stone structure with no apparent entrance. Its function remains unknown. Some scholars believe it symbolized grain and fertility. Others see it as a representation of sacred kingship. No human remains were ever found within the tower. Perhaps it was never meant to be entered. What purpose did it serve? The walls are also enigmatic. They do not enclose dwellings and do not seem defensive. Instead, they channel and divide space, directing movement, shaping rituals. The great enclosure and the hill complex above it may have served different ceremonial functions, perhaps separating royalty from commoners, or the sacred from the profane. But the meanings behind their design remain speculative. Even the city's decline is unclear. By the late 15th century, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. Its political center shifted northward to sites like Kami and Mutapa. But why? Some archaeologists point to environmental degradation, overgrazing, soil depletion, or deforestation. Others suggest political instability or shifting trade routes along the Swahili coast. The arrival of Portuguese merchants in the Indian Ocean may have disrupted existing systems of exchange. Nevertheless, the timing is strange. Great Zimbabwe declined without signs of warfare or catastrophe. Its fall was gradual, quiet, and largely undocumented. Had the site lost its sacred status? Was its abandonment a result of internal shifts in belief or royal succession? Even more intriguing are the artifacts left behind. The stone birds, stylized, abstract, perched on stone pillars, were found throughout the site. They appear to have had symbolic or spiritual significance. Some have been interpreted as totems, others as representations of ancestors or divine messengers. 8 such birds are known, and they have become a national symbol of Zimbabwe. But their precise meaning is lost. Were these birds part of a lost cosmology, a forgotten theology of flight and spirit? There is also the question of what was never found. No written texts, no carved glyphs, no monumental inscriptions declaring kings or victories. And yet the site was clearly a center of power. Could there have been a priestly class whose knowledge was passed down orally? Did the rulers of Great Zimbabwe rely on ritual rather than text to maintain authority? Perhaps the greatest mystery of all lies in why the city was built in this form at all. No other known settlement in sub-Saharan Africa before or after employed stone architecture on this scale. The technology was unique, the aesthetic deliberate. Was Great Zimbabwe part of a broader cultural pattern we no longer recognize? One whose other centers have been lost to time, erosion, or conquest? Or was it truly unique? Today, Great Zimbabwe stands not in ruins, but in silence. Grass grows between the stones. Tourists come and go. The surrounding hills watch, unchanged. The site has been returned to its people, its myths reclaimed in their rightful origin. But the deeper meanings, the full story of what this place was, who built it, and why they left, remain hidden. What else might lie buried beneath the rubble or scattered through the unwritten histories? And if the stones could speak, what would they tell us of an empire that once rose quietly and magnificently from the hills of Africa and then faded into mystery? Pacific navigators, knowledge carried in memory. In the stillness of the pre-dawn ocean, beneath the light of a sky untouched by modern illumination, a single outrigger canoe crosses the vastness of the Pacific. Its sail whispers against the wind. Beneath its wooden hull, the world's largest body of water stretches endlessly in every direction, no land in sight, no compass to guide. And yet, its navigator knows precisely where he is, reading the stars, the swell, the flight of birds, the color of the sea. This is not guesswork. This is knowledge, intimate, ancestral, precise. But where did this knowledge come from? And how far back do these stories truly reach? Long before the age of European exploration, the peoples of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia had already mapped the ocean with astonishing accuracy. From Hawaii to Aotearoa, from Easter Island to the distant atolls of Micronesia, they traversed thousands of miles of open ocean without written charts or metal instruments. Using memory, chance, and stellar wisdom, they found islands as little as a mile wide and seas the size of continents. These were not accidental drifts on ocean currents. These were planned voyages, repeatable, refined. The earliest traces of Pacific voyaging date back over 3,000 years, originating from the Bismarck Archipelago near Papua New Guinea. From there, the Lapita people, recognizable by their distinctive dentate-stamped pottery, began to move eastward. By 1000 BCE, they had reached Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And then a silence. For almost 1,500 years, the expansion paused. This lull, called the Long Pause by scholars, remains one of the great enigmas of human migration. Why did the voyaging stop? Were there environmental shifts, social constraints? Or is the pause an illusion created by the lack of archaeological data? When the migration resumed around 800 CE, it did so with astonishing breadth and speed. Within the next few centuries, Polynesian peoples reached Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui, Easter Island in the east, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the south, the widest oceanic diaspora in human history. And they left behind no stone monuments, no imperial buildings, no written chronicles carved into walls. Instead, their histories were carried in chants, in genealogies, in navigation songs passed down orally from master to apprentice. How many of these stories have vanished into the waves of time? We know that some traditions survived. In the Caroline Islands, for instance, the art of non-instrumental navigation was preserved into the 20th century by masters like Maupi Ailug. He taught using the Itakarn, an abstract mental system of bearings at sea, built on star positions, ocean swells, and even distant lightning. Polynesian navigation, it turns out, is as much philosophy as science. But without written records, how can we trace the full history of their movements? Recent research in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology has helped to reconstruct parts of the Pacific narrative. But the deeper we look, the more questions arise. Linguists find connections between the languages of distant islands. Geneticists trace the spread of chickens, rats, and yams over incredible distances. Some studies even suggest contact between Polynesians and pre-Columbian South Americans. Sweet potatoes, native to the Andes, have been found throughout Polynesia long before European contact. Did Pacific navigators reach the Americas? If so, why do the oral traditions of most islands remain silent about these encounters? Was it a single voyage, long forgotten? Or were there sustained interactions erased by time or dismissed by scholars too quick to disbelieve? There is also the question of the great stone monuments left behind. On Rapa Nui, the Moai statues face inland, their backs to the sea, their purpose still debated. On Tonga and Samoa, massive stone triliths and star mounds suggest advanced engineering and celestial alignment. On Pohnpei in Micronesia, the ruined city of Nanmadol rises from a coral lagoon, an entire city built on artificial islets, its basalt structures weighing many tons. Were these constructions part of a broader, shared maritime culture? Or do they hint at regional kingdoms and priesthoods whose histories were lost? Some oral traditions speak of distant homelands now submerged. Myths tell of sunken lands, of ancestral voyagers fleeing disaster, of gods who shaped the sea. While many are interpreted metaphorically, could some preserve memories of actual geological events, of rising sea levels, of tsunamis, or of submerged archipelagos now erased from maps? Modern researchers suggest that sea level rise after the last ice age drowned large parts of earlier Pacific settlements. Could entire chapters of this oceanic civilization lie beneath the waves? Villages, temples, or harbors now buried under silt? And what of the knowledge systems themselves? Chants that once encoded entire navigation maps were forgotten. Rituals that linked star charts to genealogy were disrupted under colonial pressure. Missionaries, settlers, and anthropologists, however well-intentioned, often recorded only fragments, filtering indigenous knowledge through alien frameworks. What then have we lost? Not just in terms of places and events, but in terms of ways of knowing. The Pacific navigators did not just move through space, they reimagined it. To them, the ocean was not empty, but filled with meaning. Swells had names, winds carried memory. The stars were not distant objects, but living markers of ancestral presence. In an age before satellites and sextants, they created a mental map of the world that was both vast and intimate, and today that map is frayed. Some of its lines are erased, some of its islands still unaccounted for. How far did they truly go? How many names were whispered across horizons that no longer have voices? And what deeper understanding of the world did they carry with them across a sea that to most seemed impassable? The answers may lie not in texts or temples, but in the rhythm, in the waves, in the silence between the stars, where stories once guided sails to places unseen before, yet always known.